Hello everyone, Santia here, and today I want to talk about what I find to be a rather interesting topic, which is a comparison of the build systems between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. I recently started really digging into how the Guild Wars 2 build system worked, and this inspired me to kind of look at it. And there's a couple of reasons why. One of them is just personal, to try to figure out some of the things that I was personally coming to experience or witness going through it. But one of the big reasons is my recollection, and I could be wrong on this because it's been a while, is that when ArenaNet set out to make Guild Wars 2, there were a few things about how BuildCraft worked in Guild Wars 1 that made them want to change how BuildCraft worked in Guild Wars 2 to try to address a few particular issues. Now, my recollection, and I think this is something that's kind of interesting to look at, off the top of my head, or not off the top of my head. I've been thinking about this a lot, but my recollection is the first big one was complexity. Guild Wars 1 has a pretty complex build system, and in particular, it was very complicated for balancing purposes. And now, I have a whole slew of thoughts about Isaiah Cartwright, and I'm not going to get into them here. But that was one of the big first ones, was just how complex the system was for balancing for them, but also just building in general, which brings me to the next point. It's really easy to make a bad build in Guild Wars 1, and ArenaNet wanted to make it a lot harder to do that in Guild Wars 2. They wanted players to, make builds that worked, and not ones that didn't. So we'll be looking at all of these systems in a moment, but the third one is what I call build elitism, but it's basically this issue that you run into, and you saw it a lot in Guild Wars 1, where Guild Wars 1 is a very team-oriented game. Guild Wars 2 has team-oriented areas, but it's not as team-oriented. But Guild Wars 1 is a very team-oriented game. You basically, for most players, because there's always exceptions to this stuff, isn't there? But for most players, you need to be in a party to be able to play through the game. Now, Guild Wars 1 provides systems and has added systems over time to make this possible without having to play with other players, but particularly in the beginning, and when the game was in its heyday, you needed to be teaming up with other people to really be able to do stuff, especially the more advanced content. And build elitism is basically saying, we want you to run this build or you're not allowed to join us. All right, you need to be playing a meta build. And this is connected to the bad builds problem, right? So if your healer was running a bad build, it would potentially cause your whole team to fail. So there's understandable reasons why, but they had some serious missteps with it. Person way is all I'll say. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over. I want to look at the games, right? I want to go over the build systems in meticulous detail, starting off with a cursory overview, and then getting into some of the nitty gritty, and then going over okay, here's how these properties, what are some of the consequences of how this works. And so we'll start with Guild Wars 1 because that's the first one. That's the point that Guild Wars 2 is reflecting off of, right? Because they're looking at Guild Wars 1 and being okay, here's problems that we had with this system. With Guild Wars 2, let's try to address those. So we're going to start with Guild Wars 1, and we're going to go over that, and then we're going to go into Guild Wars 2. So I'm going to jump into game in just a moment and go over that stuff. Hello everyone, this is Lillian Yggdrasil, and welcome to Guild Wars 1. So we're going to start here by talking about BuildCraft. Now there are several Hello. Microphone. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Hello everyone. Welcome to Guild Wars 1 and Lillian Yggdrasil, who I will be talking about BuildCraft in Guild Wars 1 on. I will occasionally be glancing down for a variety of reasons, not least of which that's where the recording is happening. And I've been having some issues with my microphone lately, so I will be trying to make sure that waveforms are happening there. But let's get started talking about BuildCraft in this game. So, there are several different parts to BuildCraft. which is why I'm bringing up various panels and my aggressively overfull inventory. Guild Wars 2 has a much better system for managing miniatures. It has many quality of life features that are improvements, but that's what we're here to talk about today. So there's a couple of very important parts to BuildCraft in Guild Wars 1. We have here the skill panel, and we have my equipment. So these are kind of the main two parts, or two areas in which you're looking at BuildCraft. So let's just start by talking about professions. You'll see here there is a drop down that I have for my different professions, because in Guild Wars 1 you have a primary profession, which in this case is warrior. You can see that here. You can see it as the W over here. And there's some very important implications when it comes to your primary profession, but you also have a secondary profession. So in this case, I have her as a warrior elementalist, but you can take any of the other professions as a secondary. This opens up several different things that we'll get to in a moment. Just one, I was thinking about this just a moment ago. I will tend to refer to your secondary profession as / whatever, like /R or /ranger, /RT or /ritualist. The reason for that is simple. There's a little slash here that might be a little hard to see on the video, but that separates your primary and secondary professions in the nomenclature. So if you look over here at the skill panel, you see W/E for warrior elementalist. So I will just often refer to like / whatever as being like indicating your secondary. So the next thing to look at here is the attributes panel. There are attribute points here. I have 200 unused points because I've unallocated all of them. So you can allocate attribute points just through this user interface. So if I put point into air magic, it will also open up the air magic skills. We'll talk about that in a moment. But also, I should add that this isn't going to be like how to make builds. I should have said this in the previous part, but whatever. People should be watching this whole thing, right? This is not a like how to make builds. This is analyzing the build systems. So if you came here like, how do I make a good build in these games? This is not the place for that. It's just not what I'm doing. So anyway, this will increase it, and you'll notice that I have some blue attributes down here. Strength, swordsmanship, and tactics. So this is +1 or this is a blue 1. And if I hover over it, you'll see your rank in swordsmanship is normally 0, but is currently modified to 3. That comes from my equipment. We'll talk about that in a bit. So you have, I don't know why it's ordered this way, but you can see my elementalist attributes here. So air magic, earth magic, fire magic, and water magic. And then I have strength, axe mastery, axe mastery, hammer mastery, swordsmanship, and tactics. These are my warrior attributes. So if I change to, say, assassin, it puts them at the bottom for some reason, but you can see that the elementalist attributes go away, and I'm refunded all of the attribute points that I'd allocated there. Now, I can just freely, when I'm in a town or outpost, a non-combat zone, Guild Wars 1 is separated into combat and non-combat zones. And you'll run into other players in the non-combat zones, towns, outposts, what is usually what we call them, but and you won't run into other players in the combat zones. They'll just be whoever's in your party. Now, right now, I do have a bunch of heroes in my party. These are customizable AI companions, and I've got them in each profession combination, so we can talk about them. So you can just freely allocate into whichever attributes you have. The maximum is 12 ranks. It does cost more attribute points per rank, so there are some consequences to this. So I could put, like, if I went through all of these, I could put a point in each one of these and just keep doing that, right? This is going to grow extraordinarily tedious, but I am also curious. Now, you would never do this. I want to be very clear. This is not something you would ever actually do in the normal course of play, because you will dilute. First of all, you only have 8 skill slots that you can see here at the bottom. All attributes do, for the most part. We'll talk about primary attributes in a moment for everyone who knows what those are. But all attributes do, and you'll see critical strikes hasn't opened, and you'll see critical strikes isn't in here. That's because I don't have access to critical strikes as the primary attribute of my secondary profession. You don't get access to your primary attribute. I guess I just have to talk about it now. You don't get access to your primary attribute in your of your secondary profession, only of your primary. So that's one of the key differences. But you just, all attributes do is except for your primary attribute. Yep, and there I ran out of attribute points because the cost got too high. I only have 4, but all of these cost more than that. So I have a couple 7s and a bunch of 6s. Is they increase the power of your skills. So for example, the axe skill Eviscerate right here is being boosted up based upon 7 ranks. So what you'll do with making a build in this game is you'll allocate your attribute points. I'm going to unallocate them. And you typically are looking for either maximizing your values or hitting breakpoints. So I can show you a really good example of breakpoints. And you know what? At this point, why keep clicking? If I go over here, this is the skill Blood is Power. Now, a key part of Guild Wars 1 is energy management. You can see this blue bar down here. It's kind of small on the screen. It's just how it is. But if I hide my inventory, you can see the blue bars over here on all of my hero panels as well. Energy, by default, is 20, and then you get 2 pips of energy regeneration. That represents 1/3 of an energy regained per second, so 3 pips is 1 energy per second. You'll notice there's a couple that are at 2 and a couple that are at 4. A warrior, such as Koss, has the base default of 20 energy with 2 pips of energy regeneration. This is modified by your equipment, so we will talk about it later, but energy management is an incredibly important part of this game because most, but not all skills cost energy to use. It is one of the key resources. You can see here this one has, on Spirit Light, there's a 17% with a red dot next to it. That means health sacrifice. And then 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 4 second recharge. There is another a resource other than, well, you saw energy is the primary one. Health is a very small one, but there's some necromancer and ritual skills that require health to be able to use. The last one is adrenaline, so you'll see that in warrior skills such as this hammer skill of Backbreaker. It requires 9 adrenaline to use. We will talk about that later though. So right here, Blood is Power. This is an elite skill. So we will talk about that in a moment, but I'm trying to get to this point. Breakpoints. So right here, it will give +6 energy regeneration. If Blood Magic is at 12, it gives +5. So this is hitting a breakpoint. If I keep going down, you'll see it remains at +5, at 8, and then at 7, it drops to +4. So if you're making a build, you might want to only go to +8 Blood Magic to get your Blood is Power up to +5. Just because you're getting more benefit at that point, but you'd have to invest a bunch more attribute points to get it up higher. Now, this guy has additional modifiers that are increasing his blood magic, so he doesn't have to invest very much to get it to 8. The difference between +4 and +5 is pretty substantial, and between +5 and +6 is also pretty substantial, but you might want to spend those attribute points somewhere else. So this is a good example of a breakpoint. Getting the difference between 8 blood magic for Blood is Power and 12 blood magic for Blood is Power is non-existent. There is no difference. Technically, it buffers against weakness, but we're not going to talk about that at the moment. Weakness is one of the conditions it lowers. We're going to talk about it at the moment. Weakness is one of the conditions, and it lowers your attributes by 1, as well as your physical damage, or your weapon damage. So hitting breakpoints is one thing that you'll consider when allocating attribute points. So a good example of that is if I go back to Elementalist, Gale is another good example. This will knock down a foe for 2 seconds, but there's a 50% chance it won't do anything if your air magic is 4 or less. So you want at least 5 air magic in order to make sure this skill works. On the other hand, there's Shock, which is a touch foe, and this will knock down regardless, but it does some lightning damage. And as a warrior, I probably don't care about that lightning damage, so you can just not worry about allocating and just still use the skill for the touch range knockdown. Now, the skill does have another property on it called Overcast, which is the 10 with a gray dot next to it. That decreases your maximum energy by that amount, and you'll recover maximum energy at the rate of 1 maximum energy every 3 seconds. So it's functionally equivalent to 1 pip of energy regeneration. That's a property that some elementalist spells have. Off the top of my head, I don't think anyone else uses it, but there might be some weird quirky thing. There's a Mesmer Elite that causes that to happen. So attributes. You have 200 points. You typically are trying to hit either breakpoints in some specific cases, or most of the time you're just trying to maximize values. So that means that there are a couple of very common spreads that you'll see with attributes. The most common ones that I typically see are what I'd call a 12-10-8. So you can go 12 in one attribute, 10 in another attribute, and then 8 in an attribute. You can also technically do a 9 and 9 if you're trying to hit some sort of breakpoint or something. Another one is 11-10-10. But you can do other quirky things. This is a little bit more optimal in the sense that there's only one attribute point left over as opposed to 5 that you would have with this sort of scenario. You might stick those few spare points in something that you want to bring along anyway, that you're getting a little bit more value out of. A common cause for that would be a hard res skill. So let's just talk about resurrection skills. There are several reasons why you might use a specific secondary profession. For the most part, you can't use your secondary profession as well as your primary, most likely, for various reasons. One of them is based on equipment and has to do with these blue numbers. We will get to that. Another has to do with what your primary attribute does. So, for example, strength right here, all primary attributes have some sort of passive effect. Strength gives you armor penetration on your attack skills. So whenever you use an attack skill, it's a category of skills that are an attack. So like Backbreaker right here is a hammer attack. Crushing Blow is a hammer attack. If I were to look into strength, I would in fact find several skills. Counterattack is a melee attack. This here is a bow attack, focused shot. But it specifically applies to attack skills, not just auto attacks. You do auto attack in the game. Different weapons have different attack speeds. We'll talk about weapons more when I get into equipment, though. So, where was I? Yes. Primary attributes. So all of these have different effects that are operating for different things. So like Mysticism is the Dervish one. Each rank of it reduces the cost of your Dervish enchantments by 4%. This is very similar to Ranger's Expertise, which reduces the cost of a whole slew of skills by 4%. In PvE, it also gives you armor while you're enchanted. Paragons have Leadership, which gives you energy when allies are affected by your shouts or chants. Those are skill types. We'll talk about skill types later. Monks have, they're the main healing class. The Ritualists can also heal. Monks have Divine Favor, which means that whenever you cast a monk spell on an ally, this is key as spell, there are non-spell skills such as Signets that do not get this bonus, and it only affects your monk spells. But it gives some additional healing. You can see 3.2 per rank of Divine Favor. So at 12 Divine Favor, we're getting, I don't know, like 35 additional health or something out of it. I haven't done the math off the top of my head, but this means that whenever she targets somebody with one of her monk skills, they get additional healing. Necromancer has Soul Reaping. Whenever a non-spirit creature, it did not used to say non-spirit, and then Guild Wars Factions came out and introduced a bunch of spirits but with the Ritualist. But you gain an energy whenever a non-spirit creature near you dies. It can be an ally, it can be an enemy, but there's a cap. You can only gain energy in this way 3 times every 15 seconds. That cap also did not used to be there. That was also broken. So for the most part, you'll make a build that is focused on your primary profession, because that's kind of what you're a little bit better at doing. And there's various reasons why. Mesmers get fast casting, for example, which speeds up the casting time of spells. And they have a number of spells that have longer casting times, which makes them harder to use on secondaries. So, but that's not always the case. So we have a case like here, Master of Whispers is using a bunch of Ritualist skills. These are healing skills, so he's playing a healing role in order to support the party. There's also various skills in your secondary profession that you might want to make use of. So a good example is Conjure Frost right here. It is an elementalist spell that makes it so that way when you're wielding a cold weapon, so that's a weapon that deals cold damage. I should have one right here, Glacial Blade. This, you might be able to read it. It says cold damage, 15 to 22, requires 9 swordsmanship, and so it deals cold damage. Conjure Frost, when you're wielding a weapon that deals cold damage, you deal additional damage. So it's a way of increasing the amount of damage that you deal. There's other various effects that you might want to go into your secondary for. A common one, for example, that a warrior might want to use is to go /ranger in order to make use of Antidote Signet. This is a skill that heals you of a bunch of conditions, which is very useful. Now, one of the things that this system has as a consequence of its overall design, it was heavily inspired by card games, particularly like Magic the Gathering, which you might have been able to see on the table behind me there. And you can see that in its design. And one of the key areas where that comes into play is with what various effects each profession gets access to. Not all professions can do everything. Now, you can go into secondary profession to get those effects from that profession. So, for example, going /ranger means that I can bring Charm Animal or Comfort Animal in PvE. Their skills were split into PvE and PvP at some point in time. I'm in my guild hall right now, which is considered a PvP lobby, and so it'll show me the PvP version of skills. But in PvE, Comfort Animal will bring your animal companion with you. They're very powerful in PvP, however, so you have to spend a skill slot to bring them with you. But Charm Animal means that anyone can have a pet, not just rangers, as long as you're willing to bring your ranger secondary and bring your pet with you. So, like the colors in Magic the Gathering, different professions have access to different sorts of effects. And one of the key ones for Warrior is Warrior cannot cleanse itself. It cannot remove hexes or conditions. These are the two types of debuffs in the game, besides sort of environmental effects, like tar. Friggin' tar. That's something that you find in Ascalon. It's a snaring effect that makes you move slower by a little bit. And it's very annoying. But because Warrior cannot natively remove conditions from itself, you might want to go into Ranger in order to get access to that sort of effect. Ranger was one of the professions that can self-cleanse. The ability to cleanse allies of conditions is more limited. Monk is the best at doing sort of cleansing effects like this. Ritualist can also cleanse conditions with some of its skills, and Necromancer has the ability to transfer conditions, and Paragon also has some condition cleanse as well. Hex Removal is another important one. Hexes are a category of skill that also provide debuff effects, and most professions cannot remove hexes. You do get Hex Removal in Monk. Monk is good at removing hexes. One of the things that differentiates a monk healer from a ritualist healer is ritualists cannot remove hexes. Mesmers can remove hexes, however. For example, with Shatter Hex, which removes a hex from an ally and then deals damage to enemies that are near that ally. Paragon technically has a skill that can remove hexes with Hexbreaker Uria, which makes when an ally with an earshot uses a spell, they lose a hex. And Dervish has a couple of ways to remove hexes from itself. So the Avatar of Dwayna, this is the PvP version, but whenever you use the Dervish attack skill, you lose one hex. It's the same way in PvE. And there's also Pious Restoration. It can remove hexes from you as well. But it cannot remove hexes from other people, which is important to note. Technically, it can also remove conditions from other people with like Avatar of Melandru. But let's talk about skills. So, there are a bunch of different types of skills, but you have 8 skill slots. And there are the super categories of a regular skill, PvE only skills, which you can't use in PvP, obviously. Player characters can use PvE only skills, but you can only bring 3. So these are some examples of them. These are associated with Norn, but if I try to equip another one, you can't equip more than 3, so the previous one goes away. That removed 2 skills from my bar, though, because some skills are also elite skills. They have this sort of golden border around them. Heroes, by the way, cannot use PvE only skills. They don't have access to them. It's one of the things that differentiates players from non-player allies. And you can only have one elite skill on your bar at a time. Elite skills have a bunch of different possible effects. So, for example, Backbreaker has a long knockdown. Devastating Hammer knocks down and inflicts weakness. It's quite useful. There's just a bunch of different things. They kind of fit into, theoretically, like what you'd consider like a rare in Magic the Gathering, or like a Mythic Rare or whatever, where it has some sort of more potent effect. Typically, this falls into the category of either like a unique sort of effect, maybe it's a build around me. So a good example of that is Warrior's Endurance, which normally warriors are quite limited on the amount of energy they have access to, but Warrior's Endurance gives you a property where when you hit with one of your melee attacks, you get a bunch of energy. You get 3 energy. And so it's a useful way of being able to do things that require more energy that warrior would normally not be particularly good at. And then there are things that like are function as what I call bar compression, where you might be able to find 2 normal skills that do the effect, but then this elite skill kind of combines those effects together. So that way you can kind of do both things at once. So, for example, Primal Rage, actually Onslaught's an even better example. They're the same sort of thing, but Onslaught increases your attack and move speed in PvE anyway. Increases both your movement and attack speed in PvE. So that combines both effects into one skill, which is very useful. Primal Rage does the same sort of thing. It increases your attack and movement speed simultaneously. So those are sort of bar compression. Then you just get skills that are like upgraded versions of regular skills and things like that. But elite skills fulfill a bunch of different purposes and different builds. But they're an important part of it. So you can take skills from your primary and secondary profession. What's really important to note, however, is that the strength of your skills scales with your attributes. So let's see, is there a way? Yes, if I do this, it will bring up the skills themselves. So you can see Auspicious Blow here is currently +9 damage and gain 4 energy. If I move that down, you can see those values move. If I increase this, you can see those values go up. This is a way that you can kind of evaluate things. So you see that there's some breakpoints in here where the amount of energy gain goes up. So I get 5 energy from 5 to 7, and then at 8 I get 6 energy, etc. PvE only skills tend to scale with titles. We're not going to worry about those because that's not a super important part of this. There are skills that are no attribute down here. These are not connected to any attribute. A key one is Resurrection Signet. Any profession can use Resurrection Signet. This is not associated with any profession. And it's a resurrection skill. This is what's called a soft res, though, because as it says in the text, this signet only recharges when you gain a morale boost. There are only a few professions that have what we call hard res, which is a skill that it's a resurrection skill that recharges. Ritualist, Monk, which is kind of the main one. Paragon technically has a few, more so in PvE than PvP. And Dervish has a PvE only skill that can resurrect allies, but it's a bit clunky, so people wouldn't tend to think of that one. But most professions are not capable of resurrecting themselves. So this is a case where you might go into a secondary in order to bring Resurrect. Probably not actual Resurrect, because actual Resurrect is very bad. Scroll wheels are so finicky sometimes. So you'll probably bring something like Restore Life. In this case, if you've done your build and you have a few points left over, you might throw a few points into that attribute to just make it a little bit better. Typically, you don't want to be... You might be using these in the middle of combat, you might not be. There's a whole list of things to say about that. Okay. It's been a lot. We've got a bit more to talk about skills, though, because I think it's really important to go over skill types. There are a bunch of different types of skills in the game. There are a couple of major categories. There are spells. So these are all spells right here under healing prayers. These are not spells. Warrior doesn't normally get access to spells. Like the warrior profession does not have any spells in it, but it can make use of spells from its secondary professions. This is really significant. There are some things that specifically care about spells being cast. There are also a few subtypes of spells. There are, for example, enchantment spells. These apply some sort of buff effect to an ally, and it just kind of sits on them. So say Vigorous Spirit here. It enchants an ally for 30 seconds, and when they attack or cast a spell, they get healed. Or there's the Elite Healing Hands, for all of you Paladin pre-build lovers out there. There's a template system. Let me actually go ahead and just hit load from template. Let's see. Old pre-builds. Good old Paladin. This is not a particularly great build, but it's a classic. So Healing Hands is an enchantment that when you put it on an ally, whenever they take damage, they get healed by it a little bit. And then there's also hex spells. Monk has a few, actually, but you really want to look at them. Necromancer has a lot of hexes. These apply some sort of distinct debuff. For example, draining health from a foe, making them take, or stealing health from them whenever they cast a spell, making them take damage whenever they attack or use a spell on a creature with less health. So there's a bunch of different effects there. These are all kind of unique. They sit separate on your bar. There are also conditions, though. So like Sever Artery inflicts bleeding. The way conditions work in this game is they apply some sort of effect, and they wear off over time. Let's actually step out of here to the Great Temple of Balthazar and out into the Isle of the Nameless. So the Isle of the Nameless is an explorable class zone, but it's not an actively hostile one. So here I have an increased move speed. They're applying an enchantment to me, Windborne Speed. It increases my movement speed by 33%. I also have Incoming on me, which increases my move speed by 33%. That is the cap. So multiple skills, like individual skills can go above that, but multiple skills cannot stack to be above 33%. So here's the Master of Conditions. There's a bunch of different ones. Disease over here is a health degeneration effect. I keep getting cleansed by my heroes, so I'm going to send them off to somewhere else so they stop failing my demonstration. Disease causes health degeneration. It's not super strong, but it does add up. And if you get near somebody who is the same type of creature as you, it will spread to them. So Mox, if Mox gets diseased as a robot, Mox will not spread disease to the rest of us. If Vec and Asura is in your party, he will spread disease only to other Asura, not to the humans in your party. Dazed makes your spells take longer to cast, and they can be easily interrupted, which just means that taking any sort of physical hit will interrupt it. Weakness decreases your attack damage, and it reduces all of your attributes by 1. So if I bring this up, you'll notice my healing prayers is a red number now because it's being decreased. Poison is just health degeneration. It's just 4 health degeneration. Blind makes you have a 90% chance to miss until it ends. That's really all there is to say about it. You normally have a 100% chance to hit unless something says otherwise, and blind very much so says otherwise. Cripple halves your movement speed. This is a snaring effect. Burning is 7 pips of degeneration, which is very strong. It's the strongest degen. Tends to be very short, though. You don't tend to have bleeding last very long, or burning last very long. Bleeding is just a weak degeneration, but some stuff cares about it. So Gash here cares about hitting a foe that is bleeding. If a condition gets reapplied to you, by the way, it just overwrites it or whatever when a new effect is applied. Deep Wound decreases your maximum health and also the amount of healing you receive. You can see that on my bar here. It's a gray effect. When it goes away, eventually tick, 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 and flash, and gone. My health jumps back up because maximum health is taken from the bottom, not from the top. So it takes actual health that you have. And finally, there's Cracked Armor, which reduces your armor by 20, but it cannot reduce it below 60 for various gameplay reasons. I have comments on that, but it's neither here nor there. So you can see what this sort of looks like. I can go over to things and we can attack them. I can put various effects on myself, and each one will apply separately. So you can see these are their own things. I'm calling this out because Guild Wars 2 works differently, so I think it's important to understand the differences. There are also a few other, quite a few other types of skills, though. Now, you can't change your bar when you're in an explorable area. You can add attribute points, so I could put points of tactics, but you can't take them away. So there's hex spells, enchantment spells, and just spells. There are also signets. Signets are specific in that they do not cost energy to use. So they never use any energy. Spells always use energy, I believe. But there's like ones that use only one energy, like Offering of Blood. Also, for some reason, this is a PVE map, technically. So don't ask me why. You can see that with a bunch of Kieran skills like Go for the Eyes, which gets changed. This makes your next attack have 100% chance to inflict a critical hit, which is nice, especially if you're an assassin. There are also a bunch of non-spell skills. So there are stances. Stances apply some sort of effect on you. There's some sort of self-inflicted buff. So like sprint makes you run faster for 12 seconds. You move a little bit faster. It's hard to tell because everything is spamming Windborne speed on me, but there's also like frenzy, which makes you attack faster, but you take double damage. So they're not always a positive effect. You can only be in one stance at a time, however. So if you have multiple stances on your bar, using one after the other will cancel out the first one. So that can be useful for a technique called stance canceling, which is primarily beneficial with a stance like Frenzy. You enter into Frenzy, suddenly somebody starts targeting you, you start sprinting, ending your Frenzy, and the double damage effect that has. There are also a whole slew of attack skill types. Some are just like melee attack. So we see these like under tactics. We have right here Soldier's Strike. It's a melee attack. It works with any melee weapon. Others are specific to weapon types. So for example, Barbarous Slice is a sword attack that only works with swords. I will end this maintained enchantment by double clicking that icon. Maintained enchantments are a subcategory of enchantment that have unlimited duration but take a pip of energy regeneration to maintain. Whew. This is a lot because this is a complicated system. So thank you for bearing with me thus far. There is also... Oh yeah, let's actually take a moment to talk about adrenaline while I'm thinking about it, because I was looking at adrenaline skill. So most of the warrior, or like a lot of the warrior stuff, uses adrenaline. You can see using adrenaline from one skill drains a strike of adrenaline from your other skills, but not all of your adrenaline, unless it says it drains all of your adrenaline, like Final Thrust does. Final Thrust will drain all of your adrenaline, making all of your skills go dark. Theoretically, because it's quite powerful. 40 plus 40 damage is a lot, and doubling their damage if they're below 50% is also quite a lot. It does cost 10 adrenaline to use. You get adrenaline by hitting things. You get one strike of adrenaline whenever you hit something, and you get a little bit of adrenaline whenever you take damage. It's pretty straightforward, really. So there's like swords and other attacks. So like there's bow attacks, for example. We'll talk about weapons more specifically, but just know that all martial weapons have attack skills associated with them. Daggers are a bit more complicated. So I'll take a moment to talk about daggers. Daggers have a lead offhand dual attack system. And most offhand attacks, although not all, like Black Spider Strike, must strike a hexed foe. But most offhand attacks, such as Lotus Strike here, must follow lead attack. And most dual attacks must follow an offhand attack, so it creates a chain. This is a dagger chain, but these are all dagger attacks. They don't work with non-dagger weapons, so you have to have daggers equipped to use them. There's also shouts and chants. Shouts happen instantaneously. Any buffs they apply cannot be removed. They just last for their duration. So I Will Survive, for example, gives you health regeneration for each condition you are suffering. It doesn't remove the conditions, though. And it expires after a short period of time. Hydration break. Let all that sink in. Keep my throat moistened. There are also chants. This is a Paragon type. They are very similar to shouts in that they, once applied, will always stay there until the end. However, there's a whole thing with how they're named and everything that's really cool, but they have an activation time, which is the big difference. So they can be interrupted, where shouts happen instantly and can be performed under any circumstance unless there is a specific effect on you that prevents you from using shouts and chants. They're usually categorized together in that regard. Necromancer has a few skills under curses that prevent it, such as Vocal Minority. For a period of time, target foe and all nearby foes cannot use shouts or chants. I should add, because this is a distinct difference from Guild Wars 2, that this here is showing ranges. So this is your practice target. This is adjacent range. This is how big adjacent, like adjacent will hit. So this is adjacent to foe. This is just adjacent. Nearby range, in the area. And technically there's earshot. There's the aggro bubble down here, which is this little white circle that you might be able to see on the minimap down here. That's the range of, that's earshot range as well. And so that's the range of effect for shouts and chants. Spellcasting range is slightly beyond that. But that's the range at which you can cast spells. So if I go over here and I want to cast, say on Talcora, I want to cast Healing Hands, I have to get close enough to be able to do it. Okay. There's also Echoes, which is another sort of buff effect that sits on an ally, and has some sort of effect when shouts and chants end, either reapplying themselves or triggering some sort of other effect. So there's a bunch of different skill types. I think I've covered them pretty well. There's definitely some random exceptions. For example, Dervish has Mystic Twister, which is a spell that costs adrenaline. Things like that. But I think that covers spell types pretty well. There's sometimes things that are just skills as well. They don't have any other sort of categorization to them. Riposte is an example of that. So this is a skill. This one happens to apply an effect to you that if you have a sword equipped, you block the next melee attack against you and your attacker takes damage. Protector's Defense applies some sort of buff. Not all skills apply a buff. I think Lion's... Where is it? Yeah, Lion's Comfort is a skill that disables your signets and heals you. It disables your signets, by the way, because there's also healing signet, so they don't want you to double dip in healing, is my guess. So yeah, that's different skill types. This becomes relevant because some things like some mesmer skills, power spike, if target foe is casting a spell or chant, they get interrupted and they take damage. Okay, so let's talk about skill effect category. Oh, there's also rituals. So there's I blanked on that one. I don't know why. So there's nature rituals. These create spirits that have effects that affect everyone in the area. And there's binding rituals, such as life right here, which creates a spirit that has some sort of effect. So in this case, life heals all of your allies within its range when it dies, based on how long it was alive. Recovery, for example, reduces the duration of conditions on your allies within its range. There's also... Oh, man. There's so many different skill types. This is really important to be aware of because it's like, this is part of what differentiates different professions from each other. So it's an important part of understanding how builds kind of fit together. But There's also item spells. You can only hold one item at a time. They usually have some sort of effect while you hold their ashes. It creates... It's this idea that ritualists are holding the ashes of the dead and invoking their powers. So, Protective Scowli, while you hold his ashes, you gain some armor. When you drop them, it heals your party members for some health, which is a really useful effect. You can only hold one item at a time, though, so if I tell him to use this again, he'll drop his current one, and its effect will go off. There's also, like, this is a binding ritual that heals your allies. Under, like, channeling magic, there's binding rituals that deal damage. Bloodsong will deal damage to enemies and attack them. There's also weapon spells. Weapon spells apply some sort of buff effect to an ally. You can only have one weapon spell on you at a time, so when a new one is applied, just like with stances, the old one is removed. Weapon spells cannot be removed through any other means other than like them naturally ending. So some have limited uses, like Vengeful Weapon triggers the next time an ally would take lifesteal or damage. It triggers and steals health from the person who hurt them, and then ends. So if you had like Spirit Light Weapon on you, healing you, and then somebody cast Vengeful Weapon on you, Spirit Light Weapon would end. So yeah, there's a bunch of different skill types. I might have missed something because there's a lot of different things to talk about. But that's a rough overview of the different skill types. They all do kind of their own different things, and things that apply effects that aren't conditions have a unique icon for them, which I think is really important. We'll talk about that more with Guild Wars 2, though. Right. So, we've talked about skills and skill bars and attributes. It's time to talk about equipment, which is part of why I'm on a warrior. So, there are a couple of different categories to equipment. There is your armor. There are 5 armor slots. This down here is cosmetic things. These are costumes, which applies armor to your body, and then headpieces, which basically it's the same thing as outfits in Guild Wars 2, but this applies an appearance to your most of your body, and then this applies it to your head. This was really nice when they changed the festival hats from being equipment to being in this system. Is a really nice change. But there's 5 armor slots, and then there are 2 weapon slots, main hand and offhand. Some weapons are two-handed. So, for example, if I swap over to this bow, you can see I can stick an offhand weapon in there, but I can't, or an offhand item in there, but I can't use it. So this bow is a ranged weapon. I can attack at range. I can build adrenaline that way. Because it requires marksmanship to actually deal damage, and I don't have any marksmanship, I can still wield it, but my damage is greatly mitigated. Nevertheless, it is useful to have something like this on hand. This is a longbow. It has very good range. That lets me pull enemies from a distance to engage combat with them without having to run into their actual aggro range, because longbows are very long ranged. Let's see. So you can see I'm outside of the aggro bubble range, and I'm hitting that suit of 60 armor. The armor system in this game is something that we will touch upon briefly. The damage formulas between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 differ. And it's useful to understand how they differ, but I've gone into what's there. So your equipment slots in two-handed versus one-handed. There's a set of weapons that are one-handed, so it's going to be swords, axes, spears, and wands. Wands are a caster weapon. Two-handed weapons are going to be your hammers, your scythes, your staves, and your daggers. Your daggers are two-handed as well. So, for example, if I equipped these brass knuckles, technically it's a dagger, and it uses both hands. So, you wield one in each hand. There's some cool... So, like, a scythe is two-handed. I'm just swapping these in and out. So there's a bunch of different ones. Here's my Destroyer Mole. I point this out because reasons. That'll become apparent later. But there's several different categories of weapons, therefore. There's also a couple of offhands that you can use with your one-handed weapons. So, for example, with my sword here, you'll notice I have a Tengu shield. Shields are one of them. They give you bonus armor, which increases your defense. There are also focuses, such as the Storm artifact. This will increase my maximum energy, as long as I meet the attribute requirement. I currently do not, but that's how those work. Let's talk about armor first in more detail, and then talk about weapons in this side in more detail. I'm going to put this bow back on, though. Here it is. This is a longbow. Okay, so armor. Armor slots are very relevant. Armor is one of the things that is profession specific. So each profession has its own armor sets. This also means that all of the professions have their own style and like appearance and stuff. If I bring up one of the heroes, you can see differences. So armor has, let's see, where do I start? So armor has an armor level. Let's start there. Self. This armor level differs a little bit depending upon which profession you are. Loosely, you can categorize this in much the same way as you can Guild Wars 2. There are the casters in light armor, which is 60 armor level, the medium armor level of 70, and the heavy armor level of 80. I say these in finger quotes because it doesn't really mean, like, it's not quite categorized that way, because armor is not shared across professions like it is in Guild Wars 2. I think that's a concession to them having 5 different playable races. You can only play humans in this game. Obviously, you can have heroes as other things, but hero armor works entirely differently. So you have an armor level, and your armor will have additional properties. So, for example, as a warrior, I have a default plus 20 armor versus physical damage. Casters normally have just 60 armor, but their armor will give them plus energy. So you can see here, this mysterious tunic gives the Master of Whispers plus 5 energy. The gloves give plus 5 energy. And he gets an additional plus 1 energy regen from his pants and his boots. If you could take his armor off, he would lose those properties. Yeah. He would lose those properties, which is not great. You want those properties. Additional energy regeneration is really good. That's attached to your armor. Paragons do have 80 armor, but they do not have the additional plus 20 against physical. Instead, they have an additional plus 5 on their chest and hands to give them additional armor or additional energy. So they have plus a little bit of energy. So there's a couple of other properties that I have going on this particular armor set. Interesting. So one of the significant ones is you can ignore Infusion. Infusion is a mechanic from Prophecies specifically that has to deal with the Mersat skill, Spectral Agony. It's a monster skill. I should add, I meant to say this at some point in time, so now's a good time. Enemies in this game use player skills. They use the same skills as players do. There are some monster-specific skills. So if I were to travel to Lion's Arch and walk outside, I am in a terrible spot for walking outside of Lion's Arch. Let's go somewhere smaller. How about, you know what? Let's just go Fisherman's Haven. From Fisherman's Haven, we can see the Wizard's Tower. Coming to Secrets of the Obscure near you. So, if we go outside to where there's actual enemies, you can see that there's some Bog Scale and a Lightning Drake, and these guys use Lightning Orb, just like a player would. Or they apply Chillblains, just like a player would, or Price of Failure. So these are the same skills that you as a player would use. My heroes are obviously just absolutely wrecking these guys, because this is not a max level area, and other reasons. So enemy skill bars use the same skills as players for the most part. There are some exceptions to this. Let's go back to my guild hall. There are some exceptions to this, but in terms of monster-only skills, and they also will not use PVE only skills, which are player only skills, really. So back to armor. One of the other really so armor levels. Let's just talk about how armor defense itself works, because there's some other things going on too. So, for example, let's grab Pyre Fear Shot, everybody's favorite char. You'll notice that he has armor plus 30 versus elemental. This is a property that Ranger's armor has. So there are definitely some differences in class armors. Also, he has plus 5 energy, and one of his armor pieces, his legs, apparently gives him plus 1 energy regeneration. So Rangers are distinct in that they have 3 energy regeneration and 25 energy with their armor going on, rather than the like Dervish has 4 pips of energy regeneration and plus 1 energy, but Dervishes also randomly get plus 25 health on their body. So armor varies based upon profession. The damage formula uses an exponential. So it's 2 to the, and then inside the exponent, it's your strike level minus the armor level over 40. So roughly what this translates out into is every 40 armor halves or doubles damage depending upon which way you're going. Now you'll notice that this has armor 10 to 70. This is a hero property that's based upon hero level. Because heroes can't equip new armor sets the way players can, instead of having a static value on their armor, they just have a value that fluctuates based upon their current level. So, for example, if Talcora was level 1, she would have 3 armor. At level 20, she has 60. So what this basically means is that a warrior will take half damage from physical sources when compared to a caster such as Master of Whispers. Master of Whispers will take, so at level 20, a caster strike level is 60. So this will just mean the damage will be the same. So, weapons are a little bit different in how they work in terms of strike level. It's 5 per rank up to rank 12 of their attribute, and then it increases, I believe it's by 2 per rank after that. So at 15 swordsmanship, my strike level with a sword is going to be, let's see, like 66, I think. So it's going to be a little bit above. So it's kind of is in its own way a little bit of inbuilt armor penetration. You can think of it that way a little bit. It's not quite the same thing. Armor penetration lowers the effective armor value. But for practical purposes, what you're thinking is if you have plus 40 armor against something, you take half the damage. There are a bunch of armor ignoring damages that are arguably game breaking, but we're not going to get into too much detail here. Just know that the plus damage on like Gauras Slash, this plus 40, that 40 part ignores armor, but the actual strike of the weapon does not. So other things that go on with armor, you have your armor level. Now each piece of armor has a random chance to be hit when you're hit by an attack. It is not cumulative. This is different from Guild Wars 2. So there is a 3/8 chance that your chest will be hit, a 1/4 or 2/8 chance that your legs will be hit, and then 1/8 chance each for your feet, hands, and head. So if you have a lower piece of armor, let's say you go to a starter area and you're leveling up your character, and you are able to get a new piece of armor, only the place where you put that new piece of armor will have the benefit of that newer piece of armor. Your other places, if they get hit, you'll take damage according to the calculations of that location. This is somewhat important to be aware of because of the insignia system. So let's go. I don't know why I walked out here when suddenly I want to go walk over to the Rune Trader. But insignias are the prefix to your armor. So you can see that this is a Radiant Obsidian Cuirass of Attunement. And what that means is the Radiant is the insignia. I'm being distracted by navigation. The Rune Trader also trades in insignia. Insignia is a thing that was added in the game with like Nightfall, I think, but we're not going to get into that in too much detail. For the most part, this is insignia is kind of fine-tuning your build. It's kind of the land of min-maxing a little bit. So there's a bunch of different effects. Warrior has quite a few different ones. some of them are somewhat significant. So Sentinel's armor here gives plus 20 armor against elemental damage, but you have to have 13 strength to get the benefit, whereas Dreadnought is just plus 10 versus elemental. Elementalist insignia will give plus 10 armor versus elemental damage, and then additional plus against a specific element. Prismatic is like, oh, you get additional just raw armor for each element that you have at least 9. There's also a bunch of no attribute insignia, so like Survivors gives you plus additional health, Radiant gives you plus energy, so you're sacrificing some defensibility for additional other things. So this armor set gives me a bunch of energy because it's mostly Radiant. There is Stone Fist. Stone Fist is a special warrior insignia. It's non-stacking, so you only need it on one piece, but increases knockdown time. When you knock down a foe, they'll be knocked down for an additional second, for a maximum of 3 seconds from that effect. Most of these give additional armor, so you can get like additional armor versus specific elements as a ranger, or like while your pet is alive. This one gives you more armor while your skills are recharging. It's extremely valuable because people like that for some reason, more than I think it's worth. There are some that have some very special properties. So there's Stone Fist with Warrior. There's Bloodstained with Necromancer. This, you just apply it to one piece of armor, and it reduces the casting time of spells that exploit corpses by 25%. Warrior also has Lieutenant's Insignia, which makes that specific piece of armor have less armor. It's minus 20 armor for historical reasons. But it reduces the duration of hexes on you by 20% and the damage you deal by 5%. So it's a little bit of a trade-off piece. Then the other part, which is arguably the more important part of armor, is runes. For the most part, runes give plus to your attributes. This is where the blue numbers come from. So you see how I have 11 strength? That is because I have a rune of minor strength. Runes come in 3 tiers. There are standard, and for some reason warriors get absorption runes, which reduce physical damage taken. But, you know. But there's minor, which increases an attribute by 1. And you cannot equip runes of... So these are the non-profession runes in insignia. You cannot use runes in insignia that belong to a profession other than your own. So warrior runes and insignias can only go on warrior armor. It cannot go on armor belonging to any other profession. So this is one of the things that differentiates the professions as well. And this is part of why primary professions are better at using their skills than secondaries, because it's just not just the primary attribute, although that is a factor. It's because you can use runes to increase your attributes. So a warrior can get higher level swordsmanship than a non-warrior can. Now anybody can go /warrior. I mean, Koss is a warrior. Everybody loves Koss, right? But like if I have, right here, command on Pyre Fear Shot caps at 12. I can't do anything about that. That's the maximum he can get. But Kieran Thackeray, because he's a Paragon primary, and Ranger secondary, he can get 15 command, right? Because he can use a rune, a superior command rune, to boost his command. Your helmet also boosts one of your attributes by 1. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you can see I have a rune here that increases Power Fear Shot's marksmanship by 1, whereas Kieran Thackeray cannot increase his marksmanship. So one of the other properties that you have is your headpiece does increase one of your attributes by 1. So this major helm of swordsmanship increases my swordsmanship by 1. And then it has a major rune in it that increases it by an additional 2. So I'm getting +3 swordsmanship for my hat. Then there's major runes. These give +2 to an attribute at the cost of 35 maximum health. And superior runes give +3 at the cost of 75 maximum health. There are a couple of other runes as well. There's Vigor that increases your maximum HP. These don't stack, so you can only apply 1 to get the benefit. So there's minor at 30, major at 41 for some reason. I don't know why it's 41 and not 40. You'd have to ask someone at Arena. And then there's Superior Vigor, which is +50. And then there are these other beneficial runes that reduce the duration of conditions on you. and Vitae and Attunement, which increase your maximum health and energy by a little bit, but these stack. So like I have 2 Attunement runes on this armor set. That gives me +4 energy from those. So runes are an incredibly important part of your builds. They can help you hit breakpoints, and they increase your potency. So they're the more important part. It is typical... So like on this character here, I have a bunch of different hats for different allocations of runes. So like I have my helmet hidden, but I have the obsidian helm here that has a superior strength on it. This is giving me more strength. I can swap, if I'm using an axe, I'll swap to my axe hat. Now I normally don't show her helmet, but if I want hammer mastery, I will switch to the hammer hat. And then this is a major strength as well version before I got this one. But different hats, therefore, like this is a common place to put it because you're probably wanting to swap that rune as well as the other one. There's different ways that you can kind of min-max rune layouts. Most of my armor is kind of general. I actually have quite a few armor sets on this character. Some of it is slightly different rune layouts. Most of it is different insignia. So I have the obsidian set, that is an energy set. I have the Norn set here, that is health. Silver Eagle is Knights, which is a special property that reduces the physical damage that you receive when you're hit in that armor piece specifically. And then I have Sentinels, which is, of course, the set that gives me plus armor against elemental damage to bring me up to 100 armor there. But I have to have enough strength. But let's be real. The main reason why I have this many different armor sets is for fashion. That's really, really the main reason. Okay. So I'll take a moment to refresh ourselves, collect ourselves. That's how armor works. I have been at this for over an hour because this is complicated and there's a lot of moving parts. And I feel like I'm talking quickly. Okay, so let's talk about equipment in terms of weapons. So I already talked about the different types of weapons. There are several different martial weapons, and then there are some caster weapons. So, for example, there are staves. I don't think... Talcora has a focus. I don't think any of these guys have wands. The significant thing about wands is they have... So, most weapons have a prefix, an inscription, and a suffix. So, for example, this is a Furious Runic Blade of Defense, and it has the inscription Dance with Death. The Dance with Death inscription is giving it plus 15% damage while I'm in a stance. That affects the weapon's damage, not weapon skill damage specifically. Although weapon damage is part of weapon skill damage. But the Furious part means that I have a 10% chance on when I hit an enemy to gain twice as much adrenaline. And defense gives plus 5 armor. For the most part, these modifiers are little benefits and bonuses. Shields only have an inscription and a suffix, and the same is true for focuses, or foci. These ones are just crafter ones. They have maximum stats, but they don't have inscriptions and stuff. Some of the stuff was added later in the game, so there's equipment is somewhat piecemeal. These ones are crafted at a factions weapons crafter, and that doesn't have inscriptions. So these ones have halved casting time of earth magic spells, chance 20%, and have recharge time of earth magic spells, chance 20%. So this is quite a useful property to have because, you know, a fifth of the time your skills cast faster or recharge faster. So that's a useful property. Not all inscriptions can fit in all types of weapons, so there are some inscriptions that can fit in any weapon, but not necessarily every offhand. There are some inscriptions that shields and foci share. There are some that they don't. So I think fortitude, you can find fortitude suffixes for each, but some inscriptions, I think like run for your life, you might be able to put in a focus. There's a whole breakdown on the wiki if you really want to get into the weeds there. But martial weapons, so wands also have only an inscription and a suffix. but staves have all 3 parts. Martial weapons have all 3 parts. And for the most part, these are nice little benefits. Now, this character has a bunch of different weapons. Like I have these Decade Daggers that look really cool. See them all fiery over there. There are a number of different properties that you can put on the prefix. For example, there's ones to extend the length of conditions that you apply. For the most part, this isn't super relevant, especially in PvE. Conditions are more useful in PvP than PvE for pacing reasons, quite frankly. PvE combat concludes generally much more quickly than PvP combat, which makes conditions and degeneration effects less useful. Because they just don't have as much time to do things. But for the most part, your weapons, the weapon mods that you're looking at, there's also Sundering, which is popular for some reason, but it's just like a chance every now and then to have some armor penetration on a hit. It's popular because it doesn't have any downsides, but it's not super useful in not just my opinion, but in a lot of players' opinions. So a lot of these weapons are going to be different elemental types because this character is kind of set up to use conjures. I mentioned these earlier, but you have Conjure Lightning, Conjure Flame, and Conjure Frost, which is down in Water Magic because it's alphabetical, is way lower. Conjure Frost. So I have a bunch of elemental weapons to work with those that deal different elements, like the Shocking Oppressor's Hammer. Grabthar's Hammer is earth damage, which works with a dervish skill. So some things care about damage types. It's not like it's really min-maxy to be worrying too much detail about them. And a lot of weapon stuff is a little bit more in the min-max territory, but not entirely. So some significant things, there is Zealous, which is a sword property, or is a martial weapon property that gives you an energy when you hit with an attack, but gives you -1 pip of energy regeneration. So you want to be hitting with attacks at least once every 3 seconds in order to be able to net more energy from your Zealous mod than you're losing to it. But it can be a very useful part of managing energy, depending upon your build. Some builds are more energy hungry than others. Assassins in particular like to have Zealous Daggers because Daggers attacks are all energy based, so it really helps them with their energy management. There's also Vampiric. Vampiric gives you a 1 pip of health degeneration, which is equivalent to losing 2 health every second. But when you hit, you steal health from your target. This is a really consistent way of getting additional damage in, but it's not like a huge deal. Zealous tends to be much more important to builds. Something like Furious and Vampiric are just nice to haves. I already talked about Furious. That gives you additional adrenaline, or a chance of getting additional adrenaline when you hit. A lot of martial weapon suffixes are going to just increase damage that you deal. So there's like Dance with Death, which is plus 15% while in a stance. There's also ones that give you additional, well, this one plus 20% while hexed. That's not super useful. Guided by Fate gives you additional damage while you're enchanted, which is useful if you expect to be enchanted more than you expect to be in a stance. Probably the most like generic one is Strength and Honor, which is damage plus 15% while health is above 50%. That one's active most of the time. There's some caster mods that give you additional energy while you're enchanted or while your health is above or below 50%, things like that. That go on caster weapons. But again, there's a lot of that's kind of more min-maxy or more high-level tactics. There's also the concept of high energy set. These are caster weapon mods that give you additional plus 15 energy at the cost of a pip of energy regeneration. So you can swap weapon sets on the fly to increase your amount of energy. So if I were to go to this one and put on the Storm Artifact and give myself some air magic, more air magic than that, there we go. You need to hit the requirement or you don't get as much out of it. So you'll see I have 32 energy. If I swap to a different weapon set, I drop back down to my base of 20. So it also is the one weapon is, or the shield is giving me plus 30 health, so you can see that change in my health as well. So there's the concept of a high energy set, where you swap to it to get access to more energy immediately, but less regen, and there's a lot of high level strategies dealing with that, but it's more of a PvP tactic than a PvE one, although it is useful in PvE, don't get me wrong. It's useful to, especially if you're a healer, to be able to be like, okay, I can just bust out an emergency like plus 30 energy. I don't get as much energy regeneration, but I have access to that energy now. It's a way of like getting an emergency reserve. But if you swap back, your energy can go negative, and you have to wait for it to regenerate back up to 0. So that's just some of those high-level tactics. The suffixes are also where there's some notably important things. There's some generic ones that increase defense. There's Fortitude, which gives you 30 more health if you have a maximum one. Those are kind of the... Fortitude is probably the most common one that you'll see, just give you a little bit of additional health. Enchanting is the other major one. This makes enchantments last 20% longer. This is the primary way that you can extend the duration of enchantments, specifically enchantments. It doesn't affect other skill types. There is technically a monk skill that lets you extend the length of enchantments, and there's some skills that can kind of mess with the duration of enchantments like that. But in terms of equipment, this is kind of the only way of doing it. Equipment is definitely an important part of builds in Guild Wars 1. Especially in the form of like runes, but as long as your weapon is dealing maximum damage and has reasonable mods, and your equipment is kind of doing what you want it to do, it's not a huge deal, which is why 4 weapon slots is not a big deal either. You can swap between them to get different properties depending upon what you might need at the moment. One reason you might want to go to an elemental weapon is because warriors have more armor against or have less armor against elemental damage types. So particularly in like PvP, if you're attacking another warrior, it's not a bad idea to swap to an elemental weapon to try to get a little bit more damage in on them, because, you know, you're taking 20 armor off of them, hitting them with an element. But on the other hand, you might be losing a property that you need, and that again gets pretty min-maxy and not something you're generally going to worry about in PvE. It's something you might make use of if you have skills that care about specific damage types, such as the Conjures, as previously mentioned. There's a few other skills that care as well. Cold is probably the most useful one of those in terms of skills that care about damage types, but it's not something that comes up a whole lot. My point here is that a lot of the aspects of equipment outside of like runes and does your weapon deal max damage, yes, no. If you're a physical attacker, casters, it doesn't matter as much. Caster auto attack damage is not nothing, but it's not huge either. So my point here is that your armor definitely matters, but mostly in terms of like how it's affecting your attributes here. And for the most part, you're probably just going to... Like, Warrior is a particularly notable case, because there's no reason to invest in Axe Mastery, Hammer Mastery, and Swordsmanship at the same time, right? Because this is, like... You can do that, but then you have to weapon swap to a different weapon, and, like, right now, I have a bunch of swords equipped, so I can use Swords Mastery. But if I equip an axe, I can't use these swords. So if I were to equip both sword and axe skills at the same time, and I swap weapons, I can only use half of my bar, or, you know, whichever skills I have. So there's not really anything distinctly different about a sword or an axe. There's damage range, and there's like attack rate. Although swords and axes have the same attack rate, and probably are both dealing slashing damage. There's weeds that you can get into. But my point here is you have access to 8 skills. You can change your attribute points in Towns and Outposts to configure your build. You only have limited attributes that you're going to want to be investing in, but there's effects that you're going to look around for different things. There's reasons to use some skills like Shock without investing in the attribute, and like that's something to always be aware of. But you invest in attributes to make your skills better. And equipment plays an important role, but not as significant of one as we will find in Guild Wars 2, which would be a great segue, except there's one more thing that I do want to mention that I think is really important to keep in mind. So I started playing Guild Wars 1 a few months after it came out, sometime in September, October of 2005. I don't remember exactly anymore. It's been a while. And by the time it came out, this is how the attribute system worked. Or by the time I played, this is how the attribute system worked. But that's not how the attribute system worked when it first came out. Because when it first came out, there was a refund cost. Nowadays, you can freely unallocate attribute points. But when the game first came out, you couldn't. There was, and I don't 100% know how the system worked because I thankfully skipped it. It was gone within the few months between April of when it came out and like 5 or 6 months later when I started playing. Because it turns out this is a game where being able to experiment with what you're doing with your builds is part of the fun. Being able to reconfigure and change what you're doing is like, it's an important part of what makes the experience what it is, of selecting your skills and figuring out what they're doing. And there's a lot of different skills. Sure, there's over 1,000, but they all kind of do distinct things. And like, some are somewhat comparable. There's Firestorm, which does a very similar thing to Breath of Fire, right? They both put damage over time in an area centered around an enemy that you're targeting when you cast them. So does Meteor Shower, technically. But there's a bunch of different skills in the game that all have all sorts of different effects. And being able to mix and match them and figure out which ones you're using and how are they going to fit into your team composition, that's a really important part of the game. And that sort of experimentation is really vital. So having a cost to deallocate attribute points was working against the basic philosophy of how the game was being designed. And so there's a good reason why they decided to change it, so that way players could freely decrease their attribute points instead of having to get these refund things. So let's actually, on that note, it is important to talk some about the broader implications of some of these systems. One of them is that you can't do everything. You have to figure out what it is that your build is doing and what collection of attributes you want access to, what collection of effects you want access to. A lot of the times, players are probably going to just focus on doing the thing that their primary profession does, because runes mean that they do that better than trying to dip into their secondary. Sometimes your secondary provides really important stuff, like you see here. But you're also working as part of a team, because it's a team game. So your monk, for example, might be able to take care of all of your condition removal needs. And so you don't have to worry about bringing condition removal as a warrior. You have your team to rely on. So that's an important aspect, but it also means that you're relying on each other. And so I talked at the beginning that this system was complicated. There are lots of different skills. There's a lot of different possible combinations. You can't combine everything at once, but you can combine anything. And so that means if I want to, I can go over to, I don't know if I have it unlocked on this character. I might not. Nope. Let's go over to Koss. Actually, Mox is better. So I could go over to Ritualist, and I could go into Spawning Power. Spawning Power is the primary attribute. Mox cannot allocate any points in Spawning Power, but he can still use Sight Beyond Sight to get 8 seconds of not being able to be blinded in order to be able to counteract blind. This is something that you can do. There's a lot of different possible combinations as a result of this. There are some really famous ones out there as well. We're going to use Acolyte Jin. She's just /Ritualist for a resurrection skill. There's the famous Touch Ranger. So Expertise, right here, lowers the energy cost of attacks, rituals, touch skills, and ranger skills by 4% per rank. This means it affects attacks, rituals, and touch skills that are not ranger skills. And there's some blood magic ones over here. Let's adjust her attributes to kind of reflect this. Right here, where is it? Vampiric Touch. And Vampiric Bite. This was after factions came out. These skills do the same thing. They're very expensive, but they have low recharges, and lifesteal is basically something you can't counteract, particularly at that time. They adjusted some stuff to be able to sort of deal with it a little bit later on, but 15 energy is a lot of energy, but at 16 expertise, you're reducing that by a substantial amount, like down to like 5 energy. And so what would happen is you could spam these back to back. And this was not a good build, but it was a resilient pressure build that was powerful in some of the less organized forms of PvP. So you'd get things like that, where it's like, oh, players figured out you could use these in combination to great effect. And so there's things like that. So it could become fairly complicated for builds, but there's also a lot of potential to make really interesting and unique builds, but there's also a lot of potential for those to fail and to be, excuse me, quite frankly, terrible. So that brings us... So a very complicated system with a lot of moving parts, particularly the secondary profession system. And the secondary profession system puts a lot of pressure on ArenaNet when they're developing the game to make sure that the professions did not overlap too much in functionality. Just like in Magic the Gathering, where you have the 5 different colors, you each has their strengths and weaknesses, things they can do and things they can't do. And commanders challenge that. But we're not here to talk about Magic the Gathering. It was important to carry that same philosophy into Guild Wars 1. There's reasons why you want to go into a secondary profession. Not every profession can do everything, because then every profession is the same. And so you need to carve out, what does this profession do? What does this profession do? In order to be able to create differences, and in order to make the system work. And one of the problems that they ran into, that they've been very vocal about, is adding new professions was becoming increasingly difficult, because it was becoming increasingly difficult to find new design spaces for a profession to occupy. There's only so many different types of things you can do in the game. So much mechanical space before you run out of space in which to do things, right? And so it was really important to Arena, though, to try to make sure that the new professions are adding carved out new niches, and that was becoming harder and harder. It's part of what led them towards what they did with Guild Wars 2. We'll talk about that more when we get into Guild Wars 2. But let's also talk about bad builds. So bad builds... Now, there's a couple of things that's really important to differentiate here. There are builds that are bad because they don't have synergies or because they're using weak skills. But there's also playing a build badly, which is a very distinctly different thing. And this brings me to the skill Heal Other. This is a very powerful healing skill. At level 20, you have 480 health without modifiers. Numbers are much smaller in this game than they are in Guild Wars 2, so you probably have noticed that by now. I think that there's commentary I can make about that, but the point here is Heal Other heals for 180 health at 15 healing prayers, which is a pretty substantial portion. That's about a third of your maximum health. That's a really strong heal effect in terms of the healing effects in this game. Most others, like this is 160, and this is an elite skill. Now, it has additional properties, but keep in mind, Divine Favor bonuses on top of this, so this could be healing somebody for, roughly, like, 45% of their HP. 40, 45. It's a pretty strong heal. It's one of the stronger ones. There's definitely ones that conditionally can be stronger. Dwayna's Kiss is a really good example. This one gives additional healing for each hex and enchantment on an ally that you target with it. So that gives a big amount. There's also Infuse Health, where you sacrifice a chunk of your health. You lose half your current health, and then an ally is healed based upon that. That's a stronger heal. But it also costs you a bunch of your own health. Word of Healing can be a stronger heal. It heals for 100 health at base, but if they're below 50%, they gets an additional 115. So that's 215 health. But for the most part, like, Heal Other is the strongest single target healing skill, and it's Faction's duplicate, Jamie's Gaze, that you can kind of get. There's Heal Other is a bad skill, and you don't use it I mean, okay, there's always kind of exceptions. It was used by minion masters back in the day to heal their minions, but this is also a 10 energy skill, which is a lot of energy. Monks are especially tight on their energy, because if your monk is not able to heal you, because monks are primarily healers, if your healer is not able to heal you because they're out of energy, you're dead. That's usually how the game works, right? If you're relying on somebody else to heal you at any rate. And you typically are, because bringing your own healing skills when somebody is dedicated to healing causes problems. I mean, you can make builds around that concept, right? Where it's more of a healing web rather than having dedicated healers, and you can find success with that because the game is quite flexible. But Heal Other is a skill that's very easy to play poorly with. This is a skill that you use in an emergency. Its 3-second recharge means it's generally available. It is not a skill you use as your primary healing skill because it's way too much energy, and you'll quickly burn through your energy pool. There's been a lot of gamecraft as well since then. There are, I should note, other healing skills that are also extremely potent. Spirit Light is one. It's 156 health at 12 restoration magic, which you can hopefully gather is quite strong. It has a conditional health sacrifice and is slightly different, but ritualist healers are typically considered necro ritualist healers, because of the energy management they get from soul reaping, are generally considered to be superior to pure monk healers for most general purposes these days, but that's a balance issue that won't be addressed most likely. So it's very possible to use skills that can be quite powerful poorly. Heal Other is a primary example of this. This is a skill that can be a trap for new players. And so there's just lots of ways of making builds that don't work super well, or you're using weaker skills or things like that. And so it's quite possible to try to spread yourself too thin. If you try to use skills from too many different attributes, other things that can be a problem is if you're playing a caster and you're trying to go into melee range, it's a good way of getting yourself killed because you're a lot more fragile. That's not always 100% true, of course. There are ways that you can be getting additional defenses. Assassins and dervishes go into the front line all the time with base 70 armor, particularly assassins. And necromancers have Tormentor's insignia that can boost them up to 70 armor. So, there's definitely different sorts of conditionals on a lot of these things. But if you wanted to get through content, especially back in the day, you wanted somebody whose build wasn't considered publicly to be bad or likely to be a sign that they're a bad player. And so you ran into problems of build elitism. The worst era of that was Ursenway, which used this PvE only skill, Ursen Blessing, that gives you an entirely separate skill bar and adjusts, it sets your health to at this maximum value, 800, and gives you 100 armor. They have nerfed the blessing skills since then because of the build elitism problem that came from it, but it's just the most efficient way to play. And because most players are going for efficiency, or even just wanting to just be able to get through the content, if you have to party up with people, it can be very difficult to find parties. This was also a particular problem. I remember back in the day, Thunderhead Keep was a very difficult mission. Lion's Arch is going to tell me I have too many people in my party, but that's okay. Thunderhead Keep is all the way down here. It was a late mission in Prophecies, and it's a really important one to be able to get for all sorts of different reasons. But man, it's so empty now. Back in the day, 2005, 2006, before Factions came out, this place would be full of people trying to get into parties. Heroes did not exist yet. There were henchmen, which are over here. These are AI companions you can add to your team. Boom, Devon added, but you can't customize them. And back then they had especially bad skill bars. They wanted you to team up with other people. And if you were trying to do that, and Thunder Keep was a hard mission back then. It's another commentary that I'm going to keep in. Thunder Keep was a hard mission back then, or at least everybody was either bad at the game or the mission was really hard, and I don't know which one it was. But it could be quite difficult to get into a team that could succeed getting through this one. And there was always a need for healers. More people we're not playing monks, then we're playing monks, as it were. Which, like, to some extent is fine. You'd usually run 2 healers in a team back in the day. But what that meant is getting into a team could be quite difficult. This was a problem with the way the professional system worked. It's like, we need healers. If you were a monk and you walked into the zone, everybody tried to add you to their party. If you were not a monk, you had a really hard time getting into a party. And that's just the way that things worked. So there's some factors that were weighing on ArenaNet's mind, right? The complexity of the build system, and in particular, the way that could create complications both with making good builds as well as like players just making builds that maybe didn't work or whatever, as well as complexities with like how did that impact the way that people formed teams and parties, as well as people's ability to just play the game because they couldn't get groups. And again, lots of changes that happened over time have eased those issues in Guild Wars 1. The game, especially with heroes, and some of the revamps to some of the henchman skill bars and stuff, you can play this without other players, and most people do these days, I think, or is my understanding. Or maybe with like 1 or 2 other people. But particularly back in the day, when ArenaNet was in 2000... I don't know if it was in 2007 or 2006 that they were making this particular decision. But after Nightfall came out, when they're working on Utopia, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what are we doing next? And they were running into problems with trying to add new professions. And they're like, you know what? We're going to make Guild Wars 2. Some of the things that they were looking at were some of these effects, right? And so the question is, how does Guild Wars 2 address the complexities of Guild Wars 1? How does it change builds? How does it, all of that stuff, right? So that means it's time to put down Guild Wars 1 and jump into Guild Wars 2 and talk about how that build system works and some of the implications of it. And finally, how well do I think ArenaNet addressed those things? Address the complexity issues, address the bad build issues, and all of that stuff. All right. Time for the next part. Hello, and welcome to Guild Wars 2, where once again, I'm Lillian Yggdrasil, a warrior, and let's go ahead and, Okay, I've just gotten done recording the part on Guild Wars 1. That was a lot to get through, but we got a lot more to get through. So the first thing you'll notice, looking in Guild Wars 2, is that we don't have the same sort of skill bar layout. We have 5 skills on this side, and you'll see something here that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then we have skills over here on this side. And then we have the mount button and, swap weapons. Another set of 5 skills. I see. So, Guild Wars 1 had 8 skill slots. Guild Wars 2 has a much more formulaic skill bar. In Guild Wars 1, you could slot any skill you wanted into any of your 8 skill slots. You couldn't put the same skill in more than one slot. And you could only equip one elite skill to any of your skill slots. And your PVE only skills, you could only use up to 3 in any of your skill slots. But you could put any skill that you wanted in any skill slot. That is not the case in Guild Wars 2. Let me turn off Action Cam, because that's what I'm used to playing with. You can see whenever I try to do the thing, it makes my character look around. Just part of their improved animation systems. But they wanted to have a more structured skill bar. Now, as I recall from interviews and other material that I saw back in the day, they were doing this to try to address the bad build problem. They wanted players to be able to make solo builds, because this game you can play solo, and they wanted players to not miss important functionality that they need in order to be able to operate in the world. So this is where we get our split skill bar. My 5 skills on the left that are attached to my weapon. So in Guild Wars 1, weapons were a part of your build, yeah, but they're not anywhere near as important as they are in Guild Wars 2. And there's multiple reasons for that we'll cover. But one of the significant ones is what you can see right here. 5 of my skills are attached. Well, is it 5 skills? This first one seems to be 3 skills. We'll talk about that. But 5 skill slots are dedicated to the skills attached to my weapon. And when I swap my weapon, I have 2 weapon sets now. When I swap my weapon, I changed my skills. Now, some of this is like hand-wavy because there's 9 professions in this game, not 10, but there's 9. There's no longer any secondary professions, it's just 1. But then there's elite specializations. So we'll talk about that. And each profession has kind of its own set of mechanics. And some of these mechanics mean that you don't have a secondary weapon when you're in combat. The engineer does not have a secondary weapon, probably because they have kits. We can discuss. There's a whole discussion to be had about how useful kits are or not. Also, I do want to. An elementalist also does not have weapon swap because you have element swap instead. I'm not sure how much I'm going to go into every profession here because that's a lot, and it's not super relevant to the main points that I want to make. What is relevant is that each one has slightly different mechanics of its own. So, but most of the professions have the ability to swap weapons in combat, so you have access to another set of skills that you can hot swap to in the middle of combat. And then you have your right-hand side of your skill bar, we'll call it, because it's on the right side of my screen. You have your healing skill, your 3 utility skill slots, and your elite skill. Now, when the game first came out, elite skills were like the whole MOBAs had exploded. Thanks Warcraft 3 and Dota. Defense of the Ancients, for those who don't know what Dota stands for. MOBA is something like Multiplayer Online Battle Arena or something really clunky. I knew them as Strife-type games because Aeon of Strife was the predecessor, but it all was based on Warcraft 3. And Warcraft 3, quick design lesson here, had a system of heroes. It was a real-time strategy game, but it has a system of heroes that would gain experience points that had up to 10 levels, and you had 3 regular skills that you would get, and then you had an ultimate that you could get at level 6. It's very exciting. So each level you got to pick a skill that you could get. So your regular skills had up to 3 levels, and then your ultimate was like 1 level, but it was like super powerful. And MOBAs, because they were born in Warcraft 3, used that same system, and Arena apparently decided, we want to take our elite skills that are all over the place, role players in various builds, or bar compression, or build around me's, all sorts of different sorts of effects, and we're just going to take that concept and throw it out the window and replace it with MOBA-style ultimate skills. And so that's what they did initially. There's been a lot of tweaks to things since then to bring them kind of more in line. We're going to ignore the fact that racial skills exist because so does ArenaNet. But you can see like Reaper of Grenth or Prayer to Dwayna. These are like skills that I have access to because this character is a human. They are all balanced to be garbage, or at least quite weak. And generally, there's a whole thing I could go on there, but that's not the point. So they made this arrangement so that way players couldn't make bars without these basic sort of effects like a self-heal. That you might need for self-sustaining. It forces a more rigid structure on how builds are made in terms of skills. Now, that's just your skill bar. When you're out of combat, you can switch so you have your healing skill. I have a couple of different healing skills that I can switch between. You'll notice all of them have blue text on them. That's for a very specific reason that I'll get into later. But these all have some sort of effect. So, like, there's To the Limit, which is categorized as a shout. It heals me and regains all of my adrenaline, and also gives my nearby allies endurance. That brings us to the addition of endurance. Endurance allows you to do a dodge roll. And now we're facing my character's back. A dodge roll gives you evasion frames, which evade enemy attacks, which means you don't take damage from enemy attacks. It's not the same thing as iframes. You can still take damage from effects that are already on you, as far as I'm aware anyway. But it does evade, which dodges enemy attacks and means that they don't hit you and don't deal damage to you or apply effects to you or whatever. So that's categorized as a shout. You'll notice, however, it has a 1-second activation time. This is because, as far as I can tell, in Guild Wars 2, they got rid of energy, asterisk. Thief and Revenant have, like, Revenant explicitly has energy and Thief has initiative, which is an energy equivalent. But they got rid of that, and instead, like, skills are based around, like, activation times and recharge times and stuff like that. So it's a different philosophy for balancing. I will state right now, I think that the removal of energy at large and a resource damage during combat was a mistake. But that's another discussion for that's maybe a discussion for the end of the video. But as far as I can tell, these tags on skills, like, this is categorized as a physical, whatever that means. This is a signet. It has a passive effect. Now, signets in general in this game do have some sort of commonality in that they have a passive effect and then they have an active effect. The passive effect only applies while they are recharged. While they are recharging, it is not enabled. So when you activate a signet, you get the active effect, and it will do whatever it does. In this case, heal yourself and grant yourself resistance, plus other effects. But its passive effect is it will regenerate health, which is, there's different ones that do this. And this is a stance. You'll notice it has a core-second activation time. Stances in Guild Wars 1 are instant activation, just like shouts. You can apply them right away. You could. There are some skills that remove stances from enemies as well. I didn't mention that, but these are all just functionally, except for like the differentiation with signets, functionally just type tags for other things to be paying attention to. They don't have any sort of intrinsic meaning in and of themselves, as far as I can tell. You'll notice this isn't categorized as anything. It probably could be categorized as a prayer if they wanted to, but so there's several different healing skills. There's different utility skills. You can, it's the same set no matter which slot you're looking at. So you can sort them out. And you can see there's a lot fewer skills. Right now I have access to, what is this, 20 skills, 4 stances, 4 banners, 4 shouts, 4 signets, and 4 physical, whatever physical means. I mean, it's like you're charging at something. Bull's Charge. There's a lot of Guild Wars 1 references. So, like, Bull's Charge is a reference to an elite skill in Guild Wars 1. 4 Great Justice gave you increased... it doubled your adrenaline gain in Guild Wars 1. It was a shout as well. There's also the human skills that you probably don't want to bother with. I mean, removing 3 conditions from yourself is good. 40-second recharge is not. You can get that effect off of... Man, I don't know what it is about Guild Wars 2 skill icons. They are so much harder for me to differentiate between than Guild Wars 1 icons, and I don't know what it is. Like, maybe Guild Wars 1 icons are simpler, so they're easier to parse? I don't know. Anyway, Shake It Off has a much shorter recharge and removes 3 conditions and breaks stun and affects nearby allies. The 5-second recharge is a bit misleading because it has ammo count, which is a kind of a neat mechanic. And then I have several different choices of elite skill. I have the 3 human elite skills that are not worth using because they have like 3-minute long or longer recharges. The Misfire Wolf was a friggin' elite skill that you would get for pre-ordering as a pre-order or a collector's edition bonus. I don't know. I don't know why I have the access to this. I think they might have just unlocked it for everybody. It's not very good because, again, it has 2.5-minute recharge for a 30-second long summon. Then there's the physical one that, like, is just a big buff you a lot. There's this Signet, which has only a 40-second recharge. I feel like a lot of... We'll talk about elite skills in a bit more detail as we kind of go through elite specializations, but I feel like a lot of the elite skills for the base implementation of the professions are extremely underwhelming in terms of like effect versus recharge and stuff like that. There's also this battle standard. So there's a few, these are kind of categorized, but there's a few elite skills going around and a bunch that are not worth using. So this is kind of like, your skills are an important part of your build in this game. And I do want to stress as well right now, I have, like, what inspired me to do this video was coming to begin to understand how, like, actually this build system works. So I don't necessarily have the best sense of how to make good builds in this system yet. That's not important for being able to analyze the system, because I'm not analyzing how to make a good build, right? I'm analyzing how does the system work, and I think I have a strong enough grasp of that to be able to understand that, as well as some of its more significant implications that we will be getting into. But skills are definitely an important part of your build, but the real meat of it is actually in a couple of different spots. There's your equipment, which dictates your attributes. So we have a bunch of different attributes over here. Okay. So there's a lot going on this screen. If you remember in Guild Wars 1, we had 5 armor slots. Well, we're now up to 6 because we've added shoulders to the list. We've also have 2 weapon slots and then another 2 weapon slots. Some weapons are two-handed, like this this spear is a two-handed weapon, so it takes up both slots. But the and these are showing me red because they could be better. Again, in progress sort of stuff. My building of my characters and then my understanding how the build system worked, there's some disconnects going on, and we will be getting into that. I do have another equipment set over here, which has a different set of things going on, and you'll notice numbers over here changed. We'll talk about them momentarily, but we now have 6 armor slots that like have runes and they have stats, which aren't the same thing as insignia. I feel like, what was insignia still existing on? Whatever, doesn't matter. And then you have your weapons, and your weapons have sigils in them. So, for example, this has a superior sigil of restoration, which gains me health when interrupting a foe. This one has a superior sigil of generosity, which transfers a condition upon critically hitting a foe. This, because it's a two-handed weapon, gets 2 sigils, so I have air and accuracy, so plus 7% critical chance, and when I critical hit, a lightning strike will hit a foe for a little bit of additional damage with a 3-second cooldown on that effect. So if I critical like multiple times in a row, it only does the first one. Now, you don't just have these. Now, you'll notice all of these have stats on them, have attributes on them, more accurately. I call them attributes again. And I think that's not a mistake. I think there's something very important happening there. And then you also have your 4 or your 6. We're going to ignore water because everybody ignores underwater stuff. But technically, you have a different helmet while underwater, and you have a different set of weapons while underwater. Underwater combat is like a part of the game, but also like kind of vestigial. But you have your back item, you have 2 accessories, you have your amulet, and you have your rings. And then you have your relic, which has an additional effect. So this one reduces weapon swap, the recharge of in-combat weapon swapping by 25%. So like out of combat, there's like a few second recharge, but it's basically non-existent, right? In combat, that goes up to like, I don't know, 9-10 seconds, something like that. I don't remember exactly, but that goes up much higher. So a really important part of your build is your attributes. Now, if you remember in Guild Wars 1 that you were just seeing a quarter of an hour ago, a little more, around that, we had your attributes were attached to your primary and secondary profession. One of those attributes, your secondary profession would not bring its primary attribute. Most professions had 4 attributes in Guild Wars 1. I didn't say this at the time, but most have 4. Warrior and Elementalist have 5, because Elementalist has 4 elements, Warrior has 3 weapons, and then a support attribute plus their primaries. So those have 5. Most of them have 4. So you'll have around 7, maybe 8 attributes. If you're a warrior elementalist or an elementalist warrior, you'd have access to 9 attributes, but that's the most you'd ever have access to. Those attributes would scale how effective you were. So the higher they were, the more effective your skills were. That same idea actually still exists in this game. It's just been put in a different spot. So here we have power. This increases your attack. How much damage your skills do. Now, the formula for this is very different from Guild Wars 1. I talked briefly about the Guild Wars 1 damage formula. This one, looking at it on the wiki, is your weapon damage. So, for example, this is 924 to 981. This is 940 to 1060. So it's your weapon strength, which differs based upon which weapon you have. Different weapons have different maximums. This is the same in Guild Wars 1. You can see I still have a destroyer hammer here. Just change that. Change my entire skill bar down here. So, you know, trying to keep some consistency on the character, right? But different weapons have different weapon strength times your power, and then the attack skills have a modifier to them. So like this is a 2.3 multiplier or whatever, divided by the armor of your target. So if the more armor your target has, and your armor has a defense value, which goes directly into this as I understand it, and then toughness also increases this armor value. So power is an important part of like how much raw damage do you deal. Toughness increases your armor. So if you're light armor, you have less raw defense, and so you're gonna like, yeah, and different armor pieces have different amounts. But this is all cumulative, right? If you remember in Guild Wars 1, armor values applied per, like there's some other things like shields would apply globally. Weapon mods that gave you plus armor would apply globally. Skills that give you plus armor apply globally. But on your armor, each piece applied to that specific piece of armor. And furthermore, it like if you had an insignia giving you more armor, it would apply specifically to that piece of armor. So if you had like one of those ranger ones that gave you plus 15 armor against, say, cold damage, if you're hit by cold damage on that piece of armor, it would reduce it, like that cold damage resistance would apply. But if you had, say, Radiant Insignia giving you plus energy on another piece of armor and you hit there, that cold armor from that other piece didn't matter. It doesn't apply. It all is one cumulative thing over here. Right. Accumulating into your armor stat. Then you have Vitality, which increases your maximum health. So this armor set over here gives me a bit more vitality, so it increases my maximum health, right? So this was 1,977 vitality, because it's a Valkyrie set that gives me plus vitality. This one is all Celestial, which does give me some vitality as well. So I have some additional vitality, which gives me more health. Precision affects your critical hit chance, which is over here. Chance to deal critical hit. Some things like the Sigil of Accuracy that was on my spear that I don't have equipped anymore because I unequipped it to put on this maul. But it's over here. Gives just a raw plus 7% critical chance. It's a bit weird to me that that gives a raw critical plus 7% rather than more precision, but whatever. Ferocity affects critical hit damage, so it's this multiplier right here that is how much additional damage you deal with critical hits. There's condition damage, which is how much damage your conditions deal. There's a bunch of modifiers depending upon which type of condition you have. So if I were to swap to this bow, which has plus condition damage on it, you see that value goes up. That would increase how much damage like my burning does. So burning deals additional damage. Conditions in this game all have different ways in which they modify based upon how many are applied. If they're damaged, they usually stack, which means that they deal more damage the more copies of them you have. But you can see this is 2,656 damage on the 3 stacks of burning. If I swap over to this armor set, which I'm not going to like move everything around, but it would have substantially less condition damage, right? So it would do less with its burning. Expertise increases your condition duration. This is similar to just increasing an attribute, right? That extends how long a condition lasts. So like your swordsmanship dictates how long bleeding from severed artery lasts in Guild Wars 1. And expertise is doing a similar sort of thing. Concentration increases how long your boons last, which boons are kind of like enchantments. It's all one universal system, so instead of having a distinct hex or a distinct enchantment, it's all boons and conditions. They did eventually start adding other different effects that kind of slot on, because it turns out that's really useful. So there's the auras and things like that. So there's some additional buff type effects and other things that they have added over time because it turns out you want them. But especially initially, they just had that kind of raw. So you can see over here, increases duration of applied conditions. This is coming from expertise, and this is increases boon durations coming from that. There's also agony resistance and burst recharge and stuff. This is like things we're not going to worry about. And then there's also healing power, which is how effective your healing skills are. So the higher that is, the more effective your healing is. So if I swap over to here, where this is 2.7, to a 7, this is what, 6.7 thousand? Swap over this set, and now it's 7,000. So it went up by like 300 because I had some more healing power. It's just kind of how that system works. So these are functioning in very similar ways. Now, it's really important here, and this is something that is really, really important. We're going to talk about it a bunch. These have trade-offs, right? You cannot, there's not some sort of like maximizing these. You have your, like, this is Celestial Gear, so it has a certain set of values. This is Valkyrie gear, so it has a different set of values. The power, vitality, and frosty from this gear is all going to be higher than what those values are on this gear because it's compensating. So just like with Guild Wars 1, where your attributes, you have a limited number of attribute points, here you have a limited number of equipment slots to adjust your attributes with. And so you have to pick which combination am I going to be using in order to be able to get my attributes to what values I want. If you want more power, you're going to have to sacrifice something. If you want more healing power, if you want to be able to heal yourself better, if you want to be able to take more damage and have more toughness, you are sacrificing something else in order to be able to get that. This is really important because a lot of games that have stats like these attributes, you're just going to be trying to increase them, right? Most of the time. Like in Dark Souls, you have to make choices about what you're speccing in, but you're always going up. You're never saying, oh, you're making a choice about where you're going to allocate it, but, or like Pokemon is another example. All of your stats are going up each level, right? And there's a whole thing with EVs and IVs, and we're not going to go into that mess right now. But a lot of times when you have stats, like this is making you make very explicit trade-offs in where you're allocating things. And this is something that I did not fully understand the implications of until much more recently, and this is part of what inspired this video. So I'll talk about what the implications of this are soon, but it's significant. The final part of your build are your traits. Oh look, underwater skills. So you have several different trait lines. This one has a special border around it. This is where your elite specialization can go if you're going to use one. So by default, there's 5 different trait lines. You pick 3. You can actually see the traits over here. And then Berserker, Spellbreaker, and Blade Sworn are my elite specializations. I'll talk about those in a moment. So for each of these, you have minor traits. Do they still call them minor and major traits? I don't know. They've changed the names of these things various times. So I couldn't tell you what they call anything anymore. But you have your minor traits, which are just a part of that trait line. So, for example, you damage foes at the end of a dodge roll. So when I do a dodge roll, I damage foes, and I gain might for each foe struck by this attack. And then burst skills restore endurance on hit, so I gain 15 endurance. Endurance is the dodge roll currency resource, the resource you use for dodge rolls. And then Pinnacle of Strength. Might applied to you grants more power. Your critical hit chance is increased. So this gives me 5% increased critical hit chance and plus 10 power for might. For each might applied to me. But then there's also the slottable traits. So each one of these will have 3 sets of 3. So I can have strength give me brave stride, which makes my movement skills give me stability when I use them. Healing skills grant might, and it looks like resistance. I don't know why it doesn't say resistance in there, but that happens sometimes. Here we have peak performance. Ideal increased strike damage, and physical skills further increase all outgoing strike damage for a period of time. So that applies a little bit of a buff to me that lasts for 6 seconds after I use a after I use a physical skill that increase my damage if I slotted that. So you can see that there's like a bunch of different effects. We're not going to go over all of these, but they can either modify skills. This one reduces the recharge of my greatsword and underwater skills, and I gain power and a chance to gain might on critical strike. Those bonuses are doubled while using those, as well as the recharge. So chance on critical strike to gain might is 50%, but I guess while using a greatsword, it's 100%. And plus 120 power, so that will make me deal more damage, just raw damage though. And the recharge of those skills is reduced by 20%. So there's things like that. There's like Great Fortitude, which takes a percentage of power and increases my vitality and frosty by those. I have to wonder with ones like this, what system they have in place to make sure you can't get into an infinite loop of your vitality raised based on your power, and your power is raised based on your vitality. I don't know if there's any situations where you can have something like that happen, but it's something that amuses me as a possibility. And then there's this final set. So there can be things like gain health and endurance whenever you apply might to yourself. So some of these can activate skills. Like this one, casts a lesser signet of might when striking a foe below the health threshold. So if you hit an enemy below 50% health, you activate a lesser signet of might, which makes your attacks unblockable for 6 seconds. Your next 10 attacks are unblockable, and you gain some might. All right? For 6 seconds. Or for 8.5 seconds because of my boon duration increasing. And that increases damage and things like that. So there's all sorts of different effects that traits can have. And then there are elite specializations. So, for example, Berserker. Berserker, let's talk, actually, before we get into that. So, every profession has a set of mechanics over here. For Warrior, it's your burst skill. This is taking the adrenaline idea that we saw in Guild Wars 1, which was particularly key to Warriors, although Paragons and Dervishes also used adrenaline. But it's a particularly key thing for Warriors, and particularly notable with them. Adrenaline was added to Dervishes later on, as I recall as well. And so you can get 3 stages, which gives you a special skill that you can use that has some sort of additional effect. So this creates a big area of effect. A lot of the... Yeah, so... Elementalist gets the different elements that they can swap between. Revenant has different spirits that they can swap between, which changes the right-hand side of their skill bar. So they have set right-hand sides based upon which spirit they have equipped, and just like swapping a weapon swaps the left-hand side of your skill bar, swapping spirits with a Revenant swaps the right-hand side of your skill bar. And Guardian has some passive effects that you can activate for active ones. There's a whole slew of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're all different based upon what things you have here. Like for Ranger, it's your pet. For Thief, it's a teleport thingy. But your elite specialization typically in some way modifies something. So there's a couple of key things it does. It gives you access to a new set of skills. So in this case, I get access to Rage skills as a Berserker. So there's a whole set of Rage skills. Right? That have additional effects that play with some of the mechanics. And there's a new Rage-based elite. And so you'll see this addition with all of the elite specializations. And you have 3 of them. And they all have different effects. So like this one, for example, means that instead of being able to weapon swap in combat, I now have the Gun Saber, which is its own sort of weapon that is attached to it. And I'm not sure where they get stats for it from, but that's never mind. It changes how adrenaline works into an entirely different system that builds up this meter and gives me an Iaido slash type of thing that's based on Dragon Slash, which is a Guild Wars 1 skill. There's so many Guild Wars 1 references. I don't mind them, but they come up everywhere. So it's just like, hey, and here's another Guild Wars 1 reference. I'm not going to point them all out because we'd be doing that all day. So then I sheath it to get my regular weapon back, right? And these have their own set of things that they're doing. They changed some mechanics, and there's all sorts of different things that happen with these. For example, this one, you no longer get to expend all of your multiple adrenaline charges, but you have the ability to use some adrenaline on a special counterattack, or a special counter skill. And like the Spellbreaker is particularly good at removing boons from enemies. That's BuildCraft as an overview. Quicker than Guild Wars 1, because Guild Wars 1 is quite complicated, but the complication in Guild Wars 2 is under the surface. It is in things like, okay, what effects do I actually need to be getting? Do I have... No. Okay, so this is where I'm changing equipment in order to be able to demonstrate something which in its own way demonstrates the thing. Where is my torch? So a torch makes this sort of field, and you'll notice some of my skills are glowing. That's because the... Hang on. I'm going to lower the volume of the game because it is kind of loud. These are finishers. The complication in this game is with the skills themselves in several different ways. So there are numerous different effects that you're looking to be able to get off of your skills. I am currently selected on my pet, and that was making my character look towards it. So skills, by and large, do not have unique effects. Some do. But by and large, they do not have unique effects. And what I mean by this is this heals me, applies might, resistance, and protection, and removes conditions. But these do not have distinct boons, right? And I'm not thinking about them in that way. I'm not thinking about Frenzy as being a skill that... So the trait system means that skills are not consistent. So, okay, I need to back up a couple of different layers. So you're looking for very specific effects in combat. Let's just start there. You're looking for combo fields, you're looking for boons in order to increase your ability, particularly might, quickness, and alacrity. All boons are useful. Swiftness makes you move faster. Vigor gives you faster endurance regeneration, which lets you dodge more often, which is really useful. Stability protects you against CC, or crowd control effects. Barrier is a new thing that they added, which is like additional bonus health. There's probably a thing. Fury increases your critical hit chance. But see, like, this character is traded up, so that way Fury also increases my condition damage. There's a bunch of different boons. Resistance makes non-damage conditions that are currently on you effective. Protection decreases the incoming strike damage. There's another one whose name I forget off the top of my head that reduces incoming condition damage. So it's a counterpart to protection, but for condition damage rather than that one, which is different because resistance makes non-damage conditions such as cripple not affect you. So there's also a bunch of different conditions. There's burning, bleeding. These cause life loss. Crippled reduces movement speed. Slow slows your animations. Quickness increases your animation speed, which means you can do more of them per second. Alacrity reduces skill recharge. Chilled increases skill recharge. Slow slows your animations, so you're slower. Poison also is blindness makes your next outgoing attack miss. Is not as harsh as Guild Wars 1, where it's like that 6 seconds would last the entire time and most of your attacks would miss. Not all, but most. Not guaranteed all anyway. There's also like various damaging conditions that do additional things. So like Confusion has a damage tick over time, but also a larger damage hit whenever you use a skill. Torment does damage and then additional damage either if you're moving or you're standing still, and I don't remember which one, which I should figure out which one it is. But it's all just kind of like, a bunch of conditions are on me. I want to get them off of me. So there's a bunch of different conditions, Most of them are kind of damage dealing. Some of them do other effects. There's Immobilize, which prevents movement, not just Cripple, which slows it. There's Weakness that makes your attacks deal less damage and have a chance to, it prevents critical hits and has a chance for you to fumble to make them deal half damage. So there's a number of different conditions. There's other things too. There are stuns, dazes, and forced movement, I guess. Taunt's also a condition that makes you like just auto attack and unable to use other skills. So like you can see daze here. Yeah, here's Immobilize and Bleed. So Bleed deals damage over time. Immobilize or Daze. I'm trying to remember. So there's like Knockdown. See, this is part of the problem. Is there's so many different like effects that are doing very similar things. So like one of them prevents you from being able to use skills, and I think that's Stun. I think Daze prevents you from being able to use skills or move. Knockdown is and anything that like flings you, like knocks you down or flings you or whatever, does the same sort of thing where it's like you can't use skills or move, and it like pushes you around, and then you have to like get back up. There's all sorts of different tags on things too. Like this is an explosion, which might be relevant to some traits. So like this one skill, which is named Mending, which is a cute Guild Wars 1 reference to the Paladin that you saw earlier, where I was using Mending. Nice little reference. I like it, but this one heals me and removes conditions, 5 conditions for myself, which is quite useful. And then traits have made it give me might, resistance, and protection, which is a bunch of additional effects. And so one of the things, like, so when you're playing, you're looking for things that are crowd control in order to break enemy defiance bars and other things, so you can control enemies. You're looking for ways of adding boons to yourself so you can increase more damage. So like quickness, so you can perform actions more quickly, so you can increase your DPS. Might, so you can increase your DPS. Fury, so you can increase your DPS because you crit more often. You're looking for Alacrity, so your skills recharge faster, so you can increase your DPS, your damage per second. You are looking for combo fields and combo finishers that apply additional effects. So like a combo field might be like fire, and if you do a leap finisher into that, you get a fire aura on you, which has some sort of effect. Things like that. So you're looking for additional effects. You're looking for stun break. So you see where this says break stun down here at the bottom. I would mouse to it, but then I mouse off of the skill. This also breaks stun. Stun breaks if you are like stunned, knocked down, whatever, it gets rid of that, and you immediately like stand back up if you've been knocked down, and you can just go back to doing things. So those are something that's really important. You're looking for those. That sort of effect is really useful. Condition cleansing is really useful. Removing boons from enemies is really useful, or in some parts of the game anyway, where enemies use boons. This is part of the problem with core design, but that's another discussion point entirely. So you're looking for all these different sorts of effects to be able to do these different sorts of things. And so because things are kind of standardized, and all of the professions want access to all of these different things, and they can't dip into each other to be able to get access to them, all of the professions kind of have different ways of going about getting all of these different sorts of effects. Some professions are better at some of them than others, but like healing other players, some elite specializations, like I believe Scourge is supposed to be a really good like support healing type thing. I've not really dug into all of those details about what's good at what, but so you get these different sorts of effects going on that you're looking for. So that's reorganizing how you're looking at and processing skills, because it's no longer this skill does this, it's I get these effects from this skill. And that might not sound like a huge difference, but it's actually a really significant one. So like you do get some amount of that in Guild Wars 1 with conditions in particular. So you're like, oh, I want cracked armor. How many skills in Guild Wars 1 inflict cracked armor? It's a good question. Not very many. There's going to be weaken armor that inflicts it. There's some ritualist stuff that can inflict cracked armor. A bunch of air magic stuff inflicts cracked armor. And there's some earth prayers that inflict cracked armor, which is dervish skills. There's definitely different ways of getting it, but not every profession can do it. For example, Ranger cannot inflict cracked armor. It wants it for a skill called Body Shot, which is an energy management skill. If you hit an enemy with cracked armor on it, you gain energy. But it by itself can't do it. So you're looking for either your secondary profession to give you access to it, or a teammate to apply the effect. But in this game, you're often like self-sufficient to some extent. And like if you can't do it directly, you might be able to do it with a sigil. So I don't know if I have it on anything on this particular character, but there is a yeah, like generosity, right? This allows you to be able to get conditions off of yourself. Nullification. Remove a boon from a foe after striking from its flank or when they are defiant. This is a way of being able to get rid of boons that anyone can use because you can just stick it on any weapon, right? And a consequence of this particular system... Oh, I also have nullification on my longbow. Whoop. A consequence of this particular system with sigils is that you can get skill-like effects on sigils, and you already have access to a lot of skills. I think the minimum skills you might be able to have access to is 13? Correct me if I'm wrong on this. But I believe a mechanist engineer has 3 like F skills. So that'd be F keys, so F1, 2, 3, etc. Above your number row. But you'd get 3 from your mech, and if you don't equip any, you can't weapon swap. So if you don't equip any kits, then you would have your 5 weapon skills, your healing skill, your 3 utility skills, your elite skill, and then your 3 mech skills. And I think that would be 13, which I think is the least amount of skills you can have, like, active on a character at once, or, like, available to you on a character in combat. Most characters have more than that. So, like, an elementalist has access to 20 weapon skills by swapping their elements, as well as their utility skills. And if you are a weaver, you have an additional set of combined element skills for your middle skill. And on top of that, and alternatively, if you're... Is it Tempest? I don't remember. There's just so many different things to remember in this game. Your attunements become skills. So instead of 20 from there, you'd have 24 from each of your attunements. So there's like... That's probably some of the most that you can have. But there's a lot of skills that you tend to have access to at any given time in this game. And this is not accounting for the fact that, like, over here, this auto attack is actually 3 skills. It's 2 different attack skills. So the first one is strike your foe, and it deals increased critical damage. So it has 50% more critical damage. The second one has increased critical hit damage as well. So it's very similar, precise cut and focused slash. Slightly more damage. It can hit up to 2 targets. And then Keen Strike. Strike your foe and gain might. Gain additional might on critical hit. So this really wants you to be critically hitting. This is a lot to keep track of. But, you know, you gain might, and if you critical hit, you get an additional might. An additional amount. I don't know why it says number of allied targets. Maybe that might splashes to your allies. Probably the most ridiculous that I've seen of this is the Thief Spear that is borrowing the lead attack the lead offhand and dual attack concept from Assassin from Guild Wars 1, and has like 3 different skills for each of these middle things. It is so much to keep track of in combat of like, okay, what is this, what is that? And the thing is, you're going for basic sets of effects, and so it's like, how do I get this basic effect from this thing? And my point here is, this game is actually really, really complicated. Like, really complicated. Like, whenever I switch characters, I have to, like, re-go through the process of trying to remember how that character works in order to be able to get my same basic effects, right? And that's, like, There's different elite specializations that then change how things work. And so I moved to this, and suddenly mending is only giving me protection. And I have these different skills. This removes boons, and it deals more damage to foes that lose boons, so I want to use it to remove boons from foes. Super speed is because they sprint, or swiftness is not good enough. And I have to try to remember which of my skills are stun breaks, and which ones aren't. And I don't know why I have such a harder time like remembering what skill icons are what skills and what they do. But part of it is because all of my skills can friggin' change, and that's ignoring all of the relics. Like if I go here and check, I'm pretty sure I would be able to find a relic that cares about meditation skills. So there's relics that care about different skill types. I know for a fact there's one that cares about shouts that then makes all of your shouts condition removal skills. I forget what it's called offhand because there's so many different things to keep track of. It's wild. Nope. It's not that one. This one makes your shout skills freeze nearby enemies. Is it Trooper? Yeah. Relic of the Trooper. Remove a condition from affected allies after using shout skill. This makes all of your shout skills into condition removal. That's based off of a piece of equipment, not even a trait. I happen to think that's a pretty useful effect, but like my point is like that can affect multiple different characters. Like I use that on my Reaper because my Reaper has access to shouts, and that was a way of getting additional condition removal onto that particular character. Is that the best use? Probably not, but nevertheless, there's a ton of different things. Now, one of the things you might have noticed is something that I'm going to talk about momentarily. But it's just keeping track of what skills do what becomes really complicated because there's so many different things that can modify what your skills do. And there's so many different things like which of my skills does this affect? It's something that I found shockingly difficult to keep track of. And I have like, you can ask me about most skills in Guild Wars 1 and I can probably tell you what it does. Like now, granted, I've spent more time in Guild Wars 1, but like we're talking the 1,000 skills there. There are fewer skills here, but each skill is generally more complicated feeling. I mean, for crying out loud, Featherfoot Grace is based off of a Guild Wars 1 skill. That Guild Wars 1 skill is a movement speed buff and gives you reduced duration of conditions that are on you, if I'm remembering correctly. That's basically what this is trying to do, right? But this is a very different skill icon than Featherfoot Grace. I don't know why this is... They can call it whatever they want, put whatever skill icon they want on it. But like, I'm having to try to mentally associate that because this is applying buffs instead of just directly applying its own effect. I am not connecting this skill icon with the effect that's on me, right? So if I use this skill right now, it gives me these two icons because it gave me those effects. It does not give me the Featherfoot Grace icon on my bar because that's not how this game works. And that's fine, but it does add a level of complication to it, and it makes it harder for me to... The word that I want to use here is grok. It means that these skills are not becoming units in my mind because they are malleable and they shift and they change, and I don't like the icons are being connected to disassociated things. So my whole point with this is there's a lot of complexity here just in the way that the number of things, like look, I hover over this and so many different things pop up. And I have to try to remember, this reveals nearby foes, and it makes your next attack a critical hit, and it removes blindness and non-damaging conditions. How many non-damaging conditions? Well, it removes 3, and I have to look down into the thing to see that, as well as blind. So this is kind of doing the effect of Antidote Signet plus an additional thing, but it's much harder for me to group these skills into a single unit because so many things happen and they change. And I think this is something that I really want to emphasize. I think that makes this game a lot more complicated and a lot harder to learn. The thing is, we'll get into it, but I don't think that complexity is leading to enough mileage in terms of what you're doing. When you're changing professions, you're trying to figure out how to do the same thing as any other profession is doing. You're just trying to figure out what their path to doing it is. That is what it feels like to me. So that's a little bit of my own opinion. But let's talk about attributes. I said we'd cycle back to these, and now it's time. So, Attributes are extremely important for BuildCraft. They were in Guild Wars 1 and they are in Guild Wars 2 as well. They dictate how much damage you do, what sort of things you're good at. And so you're trying to match, like right here, right? This deals damage and it wants you to be critically hitting. Therefore, it makes me want to have high precision and probably good power. So I probably want the Assassin's set for Daggers specifically. Because it's not really dealing condition damage. Now, there is condition damage on Torch. So maybe these don't necessarily go together super well because they're pulling in different directions. And this is one of the things that's so complicated about the system is when you're trying to optimize things, you are looking at what weapons am I bringing? How am I getting damage out of them? What am I cycling between in order to be able to get that damage? What effects am I getting off of my weapon skills? For example, Flames of War is a Condi cleanse, right? As well as a combo field fire, which maybe you want those effects. The cripple on here helps with breaking enemy defiance, which leaves them vulnerable for tougher enemies. This also does does defiance break. You can see that there. So there's just lots of things that I'm needing to process with, like, okay, what attributes do I want? Do I need to extend the duration of my boons? Do I need to extend the duration of my conditions? So if I'm doing condition damage, I'm going to want to crank this value up, and I'm going to want to increase the duration of my conditions so that my damage conditions last longer and therefore can apply more ticks of damage. That's a lot to sort of keep track of. Here's the thing. This is all bound to your equipment. And I think it's really important to emphasize this. Your attributes are bound to your equipment. If you have made a build that is not as functional in this game, because you can make weak builds in this game, what you are most likely doing is having a lack of synergy in your skills, and that includes your weapon selection, and a poor optimization of your attributes. It is similar to, if you remember back in the Guild Wars 1 section, when I was going through and being like, you would never do this, and putting attribute points methodically in all of my attributes to increase them all evenly. That is functionally what I've done with Celestial Armor. I'm not good at anything or bad at anything, right? It's just flat. And the problem with that is that lack of optimization means that I'm not going to be able to deal as much damage, which means enemies are going to take longer to die. Or I'm not going to be as good at healing. There's various things that become consequences to that particular set of design. Now, what's interesting is because I have I don't know, there's a bunch of different things with how some of the Celestial stuff works, but like this gives me more power, precision, and vitality and frosty and stuff. So it's like, I don't know, there's still aspects of this that I need to pick apart and sort of analyze, but it's like some of these values are much higher because they're the ones that are attached to my weapons, right? And my weapons aren't Celestial. So here's the thing. If you have found that your attributes aren't good, you need to replace your equipment. And that can become quite a lot. If you want a different relic effect, you have to go and acquire that relic. And if we looked back here, relics ain't cheap. Right? Like, if we sort these by price, looks like some of the cheapest ones are about, like, 13 gold. Now, I'm sure if you are, like, a hardcore enough player, like, you can afford these. But, they take up inventory space. And yeah, you get multiple equipment panels. You've been seeing me swap between them. But if you want to unlock more than having just two, you have to buy them. And like, if you realize, oh, I've made a mistake in my runes, or I've made a mistake in my, because remember, you have 12 ranks of attribute points. Well, you have 12 armor slots. functionally. You have these 6 and you have these 6, right? It's kind of an equivalent, except you remember I was mentioning how in Guild Wars 1 originally released, they had a cost that you had to pay to unallocate attribute points. It's kind of what's happening here. There is, of course, a workaround, and that's legendary stuff that lets you swap. I don't have any, but so I can't show it to you, but legendary swap lets you, or legendary equipment lets you change attributes freely, which means you either have, if you don't have legendary stuff, it's much harder to experiment with builds, because making a build is a huge investment in terms of resources, in terms of getting your armor. And that's a consequence of how the system is designed. It is similar to having to pay to set up your attributes, because instead of your attributes being connected to a panel, some sort of UI panel, like over here, it's attached to equipment. And it would be like if you had an armor piece in Guild Wars 1 that came with an allocation of your air magic and your strength. Or like this warrior armor piece gives plus air magic and plus strength, and this one gives plus swordsmanship or whatever, and where you're having to mix and match your armor pieces in order to be able to allocate your attribute points. That is somewhat what it is like in this game. Now, the trait system throws a wrinkle into that. Don't get me wrong. But this is something that struck me recently. And part of why I wanted to make this video, your attributes are, because they're locked to your equipment, and because legendary gear is the main way, there's other ways that you can change ascended gear, I believe. But if you're, getting ascended gear is also a process. A slow one that you can steadily do. But if you are oh, I wanted to change out my runes, I want to change out my relic effect, you have to go and acquire those things. I want to change out my trinkets, you have to go and acquire those things in order to be able to play with builds and to be able to experiment and etc. So, in some regards, it feels like there's a huge amount of equipment grind in order to get legendary gear, in order to be able to experiment with builds more readily and efficiently. And that's something that I think is a huge detriment to the game, personally. So, that's kind of... There's probably some build things that I missed, but I just kind of want to review everything as my scroll wheel is finicky and won't let me zoom in properly. So, when it comes to builds in this game, the build system ends up having a lot of moving pieces, and superficially, it seems simpler than Guild Wars 1. You don't have to worry about picking your secondary profession. Get my thumb into view here. You don't have to worry about picking your secondary profession. You don't have to, there's far fewer skills themselves to choose between, but you do have to choose between all of your trait lines as well, and which weapons you're using, which affect which skills you're using. So on the one hand, that seems simpler, but on the other hand, it's also quite a lot. But not having to worry about those profession things, having fewer skills to choose between, that is superficially simpler. But what I have found, analyzing it, is experimenting with builds is harder, because being able to change your attributes in order to be able to optimize your builds to actually get good value out of them is more difficult. It's way more resource intensive. Yes, in Guild Wars 1, setting up your runes was important. But you had, 4 attribute, maybe 5 attribute lines that you're applying runes to? You could get really min-maxy with it, but for the most part, it wasn't important, right? You probably had a major or superior rune on the headpiece for whichever attribute you're focusing on the most, and then you have the attributes that are going to be support attributes that you have minors on, and you probably have minors on all of those on your armor pieces. If you're really min-maxing, you might have several pieces of armor that you swap around in order to be able to change your runes, but most players aren't going to do that, and you don't need to in order to be able to play the game at a competent level. High-level content, you can generally do. The main time you need to get super optimized in Guild Wars 1 is if you're doing some sort of challenge run, a speed clear, or or things like that. Right? That's when you need to get really optimized. And yes, some runes are expensive in Guild Wars 1. And the market has gotten really wonky due to just the stage that the game is in, right? It is still around, it is still playable, it is still a lot of fun. But it has gotten real wonky in terms of some of that market. You can find runes on armor, though, just like you can in this game. You can actually find runes that you might want to use on armor, which is much, much rarer to have happen in this game. Getting max level armor is far simpler in Guild Wars 1. I didn't show the process. Like, you can just buy stuff off of the trading post, but in Guild Wars 1, you can just craft armor relatively. It's not free. Dear goodness. I've been... At the time of recording this video, I've been slowly working on a new secondary account in Guild Wars 1, and definitely getting the resources up and the money that you need in order to be able to craft max armor is definitely not nothing, but it's not a huge deal either. And so there's just the equipment burden in Guild Wars 1 is much lower, and it's much higher in Guild Wars 2. The other thing that I think is really important is in Guild Wars 2, I think skills are way harder to grok. Things are way more complicated on an individual piece level. Yes, there are fewer pieces, but if you look at those pieces, they are malleable. In Guild Wars 2, they are malleable, they change, and it's hard to keep track of exactly what effects you're getting on what if you spend some time away from something. Yes, you can learn, you can remember, but if I'm changing between builds, right, as I showed you, I swap to this build, I have a different healing skill with a different set of effects, that's fine. But here, mending gives me protection, and in this build, it also gives me power and resistance. It is not consistent. Frenzy gives me barrier and vigor, and I think those are traded. So, like, there's different things that when you look at your skills, like, all of these, because of a trait, give barrier and vigor. And so, things become inconsistent as a result. And that inconsistency makes it harder to remember what skills do what. And between different setups that you have, it makes it harder to remember. Even jumping from character to character, you come back and you have to be like, what does this do again? This has been my experience. And I'm sure that there are people who have a lot of time in this game who have, you know, I have 1,653 hours in this game. And I bet you a lot of that, like, I came back to this game like a year and a half ago. Not long, like the summer, or like a couple months before Secrets of the Secure came out, because I had gotten bored with it back in the day, and I found that changes that they'd made to how combat works, they being ArenaNet, changes that ArenaNet made to how combat works with like Path of Fire and stuff, made the game a lot more fun for me. But as I've dug into things more with the builds, I find myself frustrated with how complex everything is versus the value that I feel like I'm getting out of that complexity. I feel like when I swap to a different character, a lot of the times I'm trying to figure out, okay, where's my stun break? How do I cleanse conditions? I'm looking for those basic effects. And because, like, the Guild Wars 1, this is, I just popped in my head. Guild Wars 1 has those effects locked to professions. So if I want to Condi cleanse in Guild Wars 1, and I'm a warrior, I know I'm immediately thinking, okay, I'm probably going to want to go Slash Ranger to get Antidote Signet. Or maybe I'm going Monk, and I'm bringing Mend Condition or Mending Touch, I think is the name of the skill. Its target touched ally is cured of up to 2 conditions, and they get healed for each one removed. Like, those are different. I don't use that skill a ton, but that's a decent option. Maybe I want Plague Touch off of Necromancer to be able to transfer conditions to an enemy. That is an option as well. But, like, there's different ways that I can go about it, but I'm dipping into another profession to do it. Instead of having to try to figure out, okay, what am I doing on warrior here. I like mending because it removes 5 conditions. It's great to be able to do that. But you're getting the same effect off of different skills. And so, like, what I find in this game is I'm consistently trying to figure out, how do I get the effect I need? How do I get my stun break? How do I get my Condi cleanse? How do I get boon removal potentially? And like, what am I doing for damage? And I'm having to try to figure out what all of those are on each one. And so there's a lot of hidden complexity in this game. So let's step back and ask ourselves those 3 things, right? Complexity, bad builds, like how much is that a problem, and build elitism. So in terms of sorry, my brain just was thinking of another thing that I'll just throw this in later, so we'll save that thought. In terms of complexity, superficially it is less complex, right? But because I find the game less grokkable, and this might be a me problem, sound out in the comments if it's a you problem also. Because I find the game less grokkable, it's harder for me to remember what specific skills do. And I don't know 100% why that is, but I think some of it's because they're not consistent. And because the effect is presented to me as a set of pieces instead of being one unified thing. So this skill gives me Fury and Might instead of being its own skill effect that shows up on my skill bar. It just applies these boons, right? So I have to remember what these boons do. And I have to and so I can remember what the boons do, right? But I have to remember that the skill applies those boons. And the skill might do more than apply those boons. I might have traded it, or maybe I have that relic, a relic on that makes it cause chill to the enemies around me, or maybe it removes conditions. Like, there's all sorts of different things that I can do to modify what the skill does. It makes it harder for me to remember. And that means I'm having to actually remember the individual pieces, and that makes it harder for me to remember skills, not easier. So there might be fewer skills, but I find them much harder to remember in this game than I do in Guild Wars 1. Because of those things I just mentioned. I won't repeat myself again. So, and then there's all other things that add to that complexity. The sheer number of skills that you have access to at any given moment, things like that. Having to remember how weapons work on one profession versus another. Bow here is different than, like, longbow on warrior is different from longbow on guardian or ranger. And the thing is, there's some commonalities, but there's also differences. Dagger on warrior is a melee weapon. Dagger on mesmer is a ranged weapon, right? So you have to kind of like keep track of that a little bit. So you don't have a unifying thing there, which is like, it is what it is. I don't think that's a huge deal, but at some point I'm rambling, aren't I? So in terms of like complexity, I think that the game is superficially less complex than Guild Wars 1, but I think once you look under the surface, it's actually more complicated. That is my general feeling. It is more complicated, but you have to get under the surface. In terms of bad builds, I think it's difficult to say. I think Guild Wars 2, it's subtly easier to make a worse build. I think in Guild Wars 1, you're probably likely to make a build, like if you make a build that's bad in that game, it is worse than if you make a bad build in Guild Wars 2. But I think it is easier to make a build that is just not effective, like it just is radically suboptimal in Guild Wars 2 without realizing it. Because I think the system is not immediately making it apparent the trade-offs that you're making, particularly with equipment. And the bigger issue with Guild Wars 2, I think, is that if you make a bad build, it is much more resource intensive to correct than it is in Guild Wars 1. In Guild Wars 1, you probably have made all of the pieces that you need. You just need to change where you're allocating your attributes and what skills you're putting on your bar in order to correct a bad build. In Guild Wars 2, your bad build is probably more in your equipment than it is in your skill bar. And maybe your traits are not synergizing super well or something. Like, that's another spot where you could be having build problems. Traits are easy to correct, but equipment is not. And so I think in terms of bad builds, it's like, it's not, you're comparing apples to oranges. They're both fruit. You can definitely have bad fruit in both of them, though. I think the likelihood of making a bad build is, like, especially as a new player, is you're probably going to make a bad build in both of them. I think it's harder to recognize in Guild Wars 2, and it's harder to correct. In terms of build elitism, I think Guild Wars 2 is better in this regard, generally, because there's just fewer gatekeeping spots. Now, in terms of Guild Wars 1, at this point in time, there's also not very many gatekeeping spots. You don't have to party in that game for the most part. Bad builds are just means that the game is going to gatekeep you, right? Rather than players, which is, I mean, still a thing that's going to happen sort of either way. But the... sorry, my brain is like, okay, what was that thing that I was wanting to bring up that I was going to put a pin in? We'll see if I remember it. But the difficulty, or like when you do want to get to that high level stuff, I mean, you're still going to probably be net decking, the functional equivalent of. In Guild Wars 1 is PVX Wiki. My understanding is that website has admin problems these days, but that was the site that people would always go to for builds. Maybe go to the Discord. You're going to be aimed towards the meta build, where you set up a set of heroes that can steamroll the majority of content. They're not optimized for most of it, so you can always do something that's maybe a little bit more optimal, but it's strong enough that it'll just push through everything, because the game hasn't had a balance patch in... correction. It had some balance patches to correct some balance problems with the anniversary skills that introduced at the 15th anniversary in 2020, but it hasn't had a meaningful balance patch since like 2012 in terms of like affecting the skills as a whole. So like the meta is stale, right? The game is not solved, but it kind of is. So like in Guild Wars 2, you're also going to want to be looking up, what are the people who do the BuildCraft, what do they say are the good builds? The people who really crunch the numbers, and you're just going to copy that. So it's the same friggin' thing. Trying to be a rogue deck builder, on the other hand, to borrow Magic parlance again, or TCG parlance, like, if you want to make your own builds in this game that are good and optimized, you kind of want legendary gear so you can experiment with your attribute spread. Because it turns out it matters in this game too. It's just much harder to modify. The gatekeeping issue in terms of higher level content, I think, is the same in terms of builds. I think execution in this game is probably harder. And now I remember the thing that I want to talk about, which is that I am allergic. Oh my goodness, the phrase rotations, just I'm going to go on a slight rant here, because this is a 2.5, 3 hour video anyway. Might as well go into a little rant here. I think the concept of rotations indicates that your game design is I want to be somewhat charitable here. I think your game design, it has too much stuff going on if rotations exist as too much of a concept. Now, some of that is like a parlance thing, because like the idea of a rotation exists in Guild Wars 1 as well, where it's like, oh, these are my damage skills and I use them on recharge. But Guild Wars 2, you're going to fall into much more of that because there's more skills, all right? So it's like, I use all of my damage skills on recharge, and then I swap to my other weapon, I use all my damage skills on recharge, and it's about using things on recharge. Part of what's going on in Guild Wars 2 is you don't have a resource system to manage in most cases, so all you have is recharges, so you just spam all of your damage on recharge, right? That's my understanding of the idea anyway. There's probably more nuance to it than that I'd have to look into. But the idea that you have some sort of elaborate rotation where you're playing your keyboard like a piano in order to go through all of your skills tells me that the game is trapped in some weird zone, and you probably have too many skills that the players are trying to use that are unengaging. And and the interest comes from optimizing the playing of their piano, rather than the application of, like, basically I'm thinking about like a game like Elden Ring, where that game has significantly fewer things that you're actively doing in terms of, like, you don't have 15 different skills, right? You have weapon swaps and slightly different move sets, and you have different Ashes of War, which is like a skill on your weapon, and then you have your light and heavy attack, and you can charge your heavy attack. And it's all about the properties of your weapons and figuring out when you're dodging. Or if you want a more direct comparison, look at Middle-earth: Shadow of War. That game has a system very similar to the trait system from this game. It has significantly more skills going on than Elden Ring. And it has different properties on weapons, kind of like sigils and stuff. It has the whole concept of armor sets and things like that, and set bonuses. But like the combat in that game is, there's a lot of, I mean, it's the same sort of combat as you have in the Batman Arkham games, right? Where you have your attack button and your counter button, and then you have some additional special actions. And that one works really well. And there's significantly fewer, like, obvious skills involved than you have in Guild Wars 2. But your actions of what you're doing is focused on how are you engaging with the combat. And I feel like, and I felt this way for some time, and I think ArenaNet has done they have done a pretty good job of trying to compensate for what I believe are a difficult foundation, and I think they've done a solid job of trying to shore it up. But I do feel like Guild Wars 2 fundamentally is trapped between Guild Wars 1's systems and an action game, like an action RPG, for example, like Elden Ring or Middle-earth: Shadow of War. And I have felt for a long time it would be better off picking a direction to move in, probably the action one. And they could do it, but probably not with Guild Wars 2. They could do it with an MMO, but probably not Guild Wars 2. Because there's too much built up at this point. You can't redo the foundation of a freaking, like, palace. So anyway, that's my little rant. The thing is, I have fun with both games. I do fundamentally think Guild Wars 1 is a better designed game than Guild Wars 2. That's a whole different kind of eggs to crack into, though, and we're just talking about the build systems and some of the consequences of them. I'd be curious to know what people think, especially people who've played both games like me. How do you feel about how the build systems work in both games? Some people are going to prefer Guild Wars 1. Some people are going to prefer Guild Wars 2. I think both games have great merits. Some people, that's the most important thing to them. I still don't understand why, but hey, not everybody's built the same, and different people like different things. And there's going to be some people who don't like the sort of real-time tactics game that Guild Wars 1 is, and prefer the more action focus of Guild Wars 2. There's going to be some people who prefer the more TCG-like build system of Guild Wars 1 and the real-time tactics feel that it has. And like I said, both have merit. And everybody's going to have their own opinions on that, but hopefully there can be an interesting discussion that kind of spawns from this. So I think at this point I just wrap up, right? I don't think I have anything else I really want to say, other than thank you very much for watching. I hope you have at least found it interesting. I hope you found watching worth your time. And I do want to start streaming Guild Wars 2 some, because I do enjoy playing it. Yes, I think it has numerous problems. Not the least of which is how incredibly frustratingly, like, locked in the build system is because of the way attributes work on equipment. Like, you can't just get more gold to buy another level to compensate like you can with runes and Elden Ring. You have to, like, change gear out. There's so many different things that I could say about it. Most games do not attach as much, like, subtle significance to their weapons and armor in the way that Guild Wars 2 does. And I like looking at the design of something like Elden Ring, or even like Guild Wars 1 to some extent, where armor is about a thing, and it's, I don't know, it's just a different. The fact that attributes are connected to your equipment the way that they are is something that I'm like, I actually, now that I've been thinking about this, I don't like this. But anyway, okay, enough rambling for me. Thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.